She survived 10 years of their laughter, 10 years of being called broken, wolfless, worthless, and still she showed up every single morning and outfought men twice her size on the training grounds. That takes a different kind of strength, not the kind they measure in bloodlines, the kind forged in silence, in humiliation, in choosing not to disappear. Today, in front of the entire empire, the man she loved will make the worst mistake of his life. And the most feared king on the continent will make the most dangerous decision of his. Stay until the end. You will not see this coming. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from. The training yard of the Imperial Citadel smelled like blood and wet iron before sunrise, and Lyanna Vale had learned early that this was the only hour the Empire belonged to her. She had been awake since the fourth bell, the way she always was when something in her chest refused to settle. 10 years inside these walls, and she still could not name the specific quality of dread that lived in her bones. Not fear, exactly. Fear was honest. Fear had a shape. What Lyanna carried was quieter and uglier, the particular misery of someone who has learned to want less and less from the world until the wanting itself becomes the shame. She worked the practice dummy until her knuckles split. A southpaw combination, right elbow across the jawline, then the blade of her forearm into the padded throat, then footwork backward before any imaginary counter could land. The movements were precise and economical in a way that the Imperial trainers had never quite managed to complement without their voices going thin with surprise. For someone without a wolf. They always added that part. Or they only said it with their eyes, which was worse. Lyanna wiped her hands on the rough canvas of her training wrap and looked up at the sky. The Imperial Citadel sat on the highest ridge of Varenth's capital, and from the yard she could see the city spreading below like a wound, or like something beautiful, depending on what year of her life she asked herself the question. Black marble towers, smoke from 100,000 hearths, the distant glitter of the Ashford River cutting through the lower districts where people lived in ways she had never been allowed to understand. She had been 3 years old when her parents died. She had not been told much about the dying itself, only the fact of it, delivered in the impersonal bureaucratic language of the imperial court. Warrior-class citizens Aldrich and Mara Vale, fallen in service to the crown during the Eastern Campaign, survived by one minor daughter, placed under imperial guardianship by order of His Majesty Emperor Kaelin Valor II. She had read that document when she was 9 and found it in the lower archives, and she had read it again when she was 14, and both times the thing that struck her hardest was the phrase survived by one minor daughter, as if she were an afterthought in her own parents' story, as if surviving were the smallest thing she could possibly have done. The aristocracy had spent a decade reinforcing that impression. She heard footsteps behind her, not the tentative shuffle of a servant or the heavy, deliberate tread of a guard captain. These were the particular footsteps of someone who believed the world was arranged for their arrival. "You're bleeding on the stones again," Darius said. His voice had always done something to her she resented now, a low-frequency thing, like a second heartbeat. He was standing near the archway, still dressed for bed in a loose linen shirt with the imperial crest stamped on the chest, dark hair not yet arranged for the day. He was beautiful in the effortless way of people who had never needed to try. High jaw, long build, eyes that were nearly gold in certain light and something more complicated in others. She turned and looked at him without softening anything. "The stones will survive," she said. He moved toward her with that easy, long stride. She held her ground by instinct, and he stopped closer to her than protocol required, close enough that she could smell sleep on his skin, which she had once catalogued as intimacy and now understood was simply carelessness. "The mating ceremony is tonight," he said. "I'm aware." "I wanted to find you before—" He paused. Something worked in his face. Not the open architecture of guilt, not yet, but its more cowardly precursor, discomfort. "I've been thinking about how to say this." Lyanna looked at him. 10 years of reading this man had given her a fluency she wished she had never developed. "Then say it," she said. Darius exhaled. He pushed a hand through his hair. He was, she noticed, not touching her, and the absence was its own information. "The Emperor is expecting me to declare through the ceremony tonight," he said. "The Council has been pressing for a formal bond that stabilizes the succession. There are 3 houses with daughters positioned, the Dravenfields, the Castellians." "Say the actual sentence, Darius." He looked at her. For For a moment, she saw something flicker across his face that she might have called real, once, in a younger version of herself that wanted to believe in real things from him. "I can't claim you tonight," he said. "Not officially, not publicly." The sentence landed the way she had known for approximately 2 years. It eventually would, and what surprised her was not the content, but the specific flavor of her own response. Not devastation. Something more arid and exhausted. The feeling of finally reaching the end of a hallway she had been walking down for a very long time. "Can't," she said, "or won't." "Lyanna, there's a distinction. Can't is a limitation. Won't is a decision. I'd like to know which one you're making." His jaw tightened. "The council won't accept—" "Which one, Darius?" The silence between them lasted the full count of 3 heartbeats. He was a good enough man to feel this, she thought. That was the strange cruelty of it. He was not a villain. He was something worse. A man too weak to be a villain and too privileged to be a victim, caught indefinitely in the comfortable middle ground of people who let things happen to others while telling themselves they had no real choice. "Both," he said finally. "I can't, because the political cost is too high, and I won't, because—" He stopped. "Because I have no wolf," she said. "Because without a wolf, I have no bloodline value. Because in 10 years, every time someone in your circle laughed at the broken orphan who couldn't shift, you let them laugh. You stayed in the room and let them laugh, and then you came to find me afterward, and I called that love." Her own voice surprised her. Flat, dry. Not angry so much as done. "That isn't— I'm not angry at you," she said. And the terrible thing was that she wasn't, not in the hot way she might have preferred. Just finished. "I'm angry at myself for making you the center of a story you were never equipped to be in." Darius stepped forward. He reached for her hand and she stepped back. Not roughly, just out of reach. "Tonight," she said, "I will stand in that ceremony because I was summoned like every other member of the Citadel Guard, and I do not run from things. But when it ends, we are done. I want that to be clear in your head before you walk out of this yard." He stood there. He opened his mouth once. Then he closed it and walked away. And she watched him go, and did not feel the things she had expected to feel for 10 years when this moment finally came. She felt tired. She felt the split skin on her knuckles. She felt the particular loneliness of someone who has finally, cleanly, cut the last line that was tethering her to a shoreline she had mistaken for home. She turned back to the practice dummy and hit it again, and again, and again, until the sound of his footsteps had fully dissolved into the morning. There is something that happens inside a person when they have been rejected so many times that the rejection stops being an event and becomes a condition. It calcifies. It becomes the architecture of how they move through space. Not with defeat, exactly, but with a particular economy, a careful management of exposure. Lyanna Vale had learned before she was 10 years old how to make herself legible only to the degree required for survival, how to give people the surface they needed without giving them the leverage that came with depth. What the court never understood, because courts never do, is that this is not weakness. It is the most sophisticated kind of strength. A broken person does not keep showing up. A broken person does not split her knuckles on a practice dummy before the sun rises, and then spend the day in the lower archives running threat assessments on border intelligence nobody asked her to review. Broken is when you stop. What Lyanna did was something else entirely. The grinding, unglamorous, deeply personal work of continuing to exist with full force inside a world that had decided you were worth nothing. The Imperial Court of Varianth had no framework for this. They measured power in bloodlines and bonds and the specific hierarchical status that came with a wolf form. And Lyanna Vale had none of those things. So to them she was a category error. A woman who fought like someone important and lived like someone invisible and loved like someone who still believed, despite every available piece of evidence, that she deserved more than the second-hand attention of a prince who would never quite choose her. That was the wound beneath the wound. Not wolflessness, not parentlessness, not the court's particular brand of casual cruelty. The wound was that she had let herself hope inside a situation that had been designed from the first day to disappoint her. And hope, for people like Lyanna, is not a soft thing. It is structural. It holds the whole building up. And when it finally gives way, what comes down is everything. The ceremony hall in the Imperial Citadel was called the Hall of Moons, and it deserved the name. 3 stories of black stone and silver-veined marble, torches and brackets of hammered iron, and an oculus in the ceiling through which, on clear nights, you could see a rough circle of sky. Tonight, it was crowded past comfort. Every major house in the empire had sent representatives, and the press of bodies and competing perfumes and the low rolling heat of several thousand people in formal dress made the air thick and difficult. Lyanna stood in the left wing with the Citadel Guard contingent, wearing the deep gray ceremonial uniform of the Imperial military rather than any house colors because she had no house. She had cleaned up, her dark hair back, the split knuckles wrapped tight under formal gloves, and she was aware of several sets of eyes moving across her and several quiet conversations shifting direction when they found her, the way they always did. The wolfless girl from the guard. Darius Valor's most embarrassing indulgence. She kept her face neutral and her shoulders level. Across the hall, she found Lady Seraphine Draven almost immediately, because Seraphine was positioned to be found. Duke Draven's eldest daughter was 23 and possessed the kind of calculated beauty that people in her position spent significant resources producing. Pale skin, dark eyes, hair dressed in elaborate braids threaded with silver wire. She was wearing white and gold, House Draven's formal colors, and she was watching Lyanna with the expression of someone who had already written the end of a story and was simply waiting for the protagonist to catch up. Seraphine caught her looking and smiled. Not warmly, the way you smile at something you own. Lyanna looked away. The horns sounded. The crowd organized itself with the practiced efficiency of aristocracy that has attended too many ceremonies, ranks forming, space opening, titles settling into the correct hierarchical geometry. Lyanna moved with the guard contingent into their assigned positions near the left wall. Then the Emperor's chair was carried in. Old Lyanna Vale, who had not walked under his own power in 2 years, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, and still more dangerous than most people in the room gave him credit for. He acknowledged the room with a single nod that somehow managed to contain decades of command. And then, behind the Emperor's chair, through the great bronze doors on the north wall, the king. Lyanna Vale. She had seen him before. Of course she had. He lived inside the Citadel complex, commanded troops she had trained beside, walked the same corridors. But there was something about seeing him in formal dress inside this specific context that reorganized the space differently. He was 32, 8 years older than Darius, built along different lines. Where Darius was long and elegant, Lyanna was broad-shouldered and dense in the way of men who had fought their wars with their bodies rather than their names. Dark hair, shorter than current fashion preferred. A jaw that looked like it had been broken once and set without much care. His formal uniform was the deep black of the Iron Wolf Regiment, simple to the point of severity among all the house colors in the room. No decoration except the commander's chain at his shoulder. He walked with the economy of someone who had learned long ago that a room will organize itself around you if you simply move forward without apology. He took his position to the right of the Emperor's chair, and for one moment, she would think about this moment afterward, for a long time. His eyes passed across the left wall of the room and landed on her. She had expected the glance to slide past. It always slid past. It didn't. Not quite. Something held for a half-second, some kind of specific recognition that had no obvious source, and then he had moved on and she was left with the strange sensation of having been seen in a way she had no vocabulary for. She filed it away. She had a long history of misreading moments. She filed it away and watched the ceremony begin. Darius descended the east staircase with the formal escort of his household knights, resplendent in the Crown Prince's crimson, and the hall responded with the appropriate choreography of bows and recognition. He looked exactly as he was supposed to look. He performed, she had to admit, very well. Whatever private discomfort he carried from their conversation in the training yard this morning, his face gave nothing to the room. The ceremony had a prescribed shape. The High Chancellor read the traditional invocation of the Silver Moon, the oldest of the old compact between rulers and their wolves, the bond between bloodline and territory that the empire was founded on. Then the houses with eligible daughters presented them, and the Crown Prince had the right of first declaration, and whatever declaration he made would bind the succession going forward. Lyanna watched. She was good at watching. She had spent 10 years perfecting it. The 3 daughters were presented. Seraphine Draven first, which told her everything she needed to know about whose campaign had been most effective with the council. Then the Castalian girl, barely 18, clearly terrified. Then the third, whose name she didn't retain. Darius looked at all three with the composed professional attention of someone performing an evaluation. Then the Chancellor said, "Does the Crown Prince declare?" The room went still in the specific way of rooms waiting for something that will change the shape of things. Darius said, "I declare for Lady Seraphine of House Draven." Seraphine smiled, slow, full, the smile of someone collecting what they were owed. And the hall moved, the rustle and release of collective breath, the repositioning of alliances in real time, the quiet economic calculation of several hundred noble minds adjusting to a new political reality. Lyanna did not move. She held still and let the moment pass through her body the way cold water moves through a gap in armor, finding every edge. She had told herself this morning she was already done. She had believed it. She found now, in the actual moment, that knowing a thing in your mind and feeling a thing in your body are separate exercises, and she had only completed the first one. This is the specific anatomy of public humiliation, not the event itself, but the awareness of the audience registering it. The guard captain to her left had stiffened in a way that meant he was working very hard not to look at her. Three nobles in her sight line had turned to find her face. Seraphine's gaze had crossed the room to land on her with a precision that was not accidental. Everyone knew. Everyone had always known that she was Darius's shadow, close enough to believe in, too marginal to matter. Tonight was just the formalization. She breathed, she held her spine level. She did not allow her jaw to loosen. Then a voice from the north side of the hall said, "Wait." Not loud, not aggressive, just absolute. The hall went quiet with a speed that was almost physical. King Kaelin had stepped forward from his position beside the Emperor's chair. He had not been part of the ceremony structure. The king's role tonight was ceremonial witness, nothing more. Nobody had given him a line in this particular script. "Your Majesty," the Chancellor began. "There's an omission," Kaelin said. His voice had the specific texture of someone who has spent a long time in command. Not the performed baritone of men who want to sound important, but the actual quiet of someone who has learned that if you stop projecting, rooms go very still to hear you. The ceremony protocol, under the Silver Compact, Chapter 14, requires the Crown Prince to formally release any standing informal claim before declaring a new one. Silence. Lyanna could hear her own heartbeat. "The Crown Prince has released all," the Chancellor attempted. "Has he?" Kaelin said. "In writing? Before witnesses?" Darius's composure had developed a fracture, visible only in the way his weight had shifted to his back foot. "There was no formal claim to release," Darius said. His voice was carefully level. "The compact applies to declared bonds only." "The compact," Kaelin said, "applies to anyone within the Citadel walls who has been accorded informal standing in the royal household. That includes members of the Citadel Guard, who have spent 10 years in consistent personal proximity to a member of the Imperial family." He paused. "That includes Lyanna Vale." The room reorganized itself so sharply she could feel the directional shift of 300 pairs of eyes. Her face. She needed to hold her face. Darius was very still. "Kaelin, this is not the time. Is there a time you prefer for accuracy? Name it, and I'll return." "She has no wolf. She has no bloodline standing. She has the standing I give her," Kaelin said, "or the standing you give her. One of us has chosen." He turned then and looked across the room. He looked directly at her. Lyanna Vale. Her name in his mouth, in that room, in that silence. She stood straight. She said nothing. She waited. "Does the Crown Prince release you, formally, tonight, of his own will?" Darius said, "Yes," through his teeth. "Then under the compact," Kaelin said, and his voice had dropped even further, which made the silence pressing closer around it, "the release falls to the king's right of recognition. An informal claim released by a prince can be taken up by the throne if the throne elects." He let that sit for 3 seconds. "I elect." Seraphine Draven made a sound, not a word, a sharp intake of breath that she did not manage to suppress. The Chancellor said, with the strangled, careful precision of someone assembling a sentence while standing above a hole in the floor, His Majesty the King declares standing recognition for Lyanna Vale of the Imperial Guard. I declare claim, Caitlin said. Not standing recognition, claim. His voice was quiet and absolute, and it moved through the room like weather. If the prince lacks the courage to claim her, then the king will. Nobody breathed. Not one person in the Hall of Moons breathed. Lyanna stood against the left wall in her gray guard's uniform, her gloved hands at her sides, her face controlled with everything she had, and she felt the floor shift beneath her. Not metaphorically, or not only metaphorically. Something in the structure of the moment had given way. The old arrangement of her world, the careful small territory she had built for herself in the margins of this court, had been picked up and thrown into a shape she had no map for. She looked at Lyanna Vale, across the room, through 300 people and a century of ceremony and all the weight of empire. He was looking back at her with the same expression she had caught for half a second earlier in the evening. That specific quality of recognition, like he had known what this room would hold before he walked into it. "This is not legal," someone from the noble ranks began. "This is not precedented," said someone else. "This cannot—" "It can," said Emperor Lyanna Vale from his chair, and his voice, thin and old and still carrying every gram of authority he had accumulated across 60 years, stopped the room cold. He had not spoken since the opening invocation. He spoke now with the finality of someone who has already calculated the outcomes and is comfortable with all of them. "My son knows the compact. What he has cited is correct." He paused. "This ceremony continues." Duke Draven was on his feet across the hall. His face was the color of old brick. Seraphine Draven was not smiling anymore. Darius Valor stood beside the Chancellor and did not look at Lyanna, not once. And something in the specific rigidity of his not looking was its own communication. He had known. Some part of him had known what his brother was capable of doing and had made his declaration anyway, and now stood inside the consequence of that calculation. And Lyanna, who had spent 10 years being the woman that nothing was ever formally done for, stood with her back straight and her hands still and her pulse running hard against the inside of her wrists. And she thought, "I did not ask for this." She thought, "I do not know this man." She thought, "Everything I have managed to build inside the margins of my life just ended." She thought, "I have been waiting to stop pretending for 10 years, and I have no idea what is on the other side of that." Then the ceremony resumed around her in a new shape, and she felt the eyes of the room rearranging themselves into something she had no history for receiving. Not contempt, not pity, not the particular brand of curious amusement they'd always offered her, but something more dangerous, attention with stakes in it. And across the marble floor of the Hall of Moons, from his position near the Emperor's chair, King Lyanna Vale had not looked away from her at all. Later she would ask herself when he had started watching. She would ask herself what a man like that, a man who ran an empire with studied silence and made decisions that moved armies, what that man saw when he looked in her direction. She would not have the answer yet. What she had in this moment was the beginning of a truth so large she could only feel its edge, that the rejected are not always rejected because they lack value. Sometimes they are rejected because the people with the authority to recognize their value lack the courage to pay the cost of saying so out loud. Lyanna Vale had just paid it, before thousands, without hesitation, without any apparent calculation of what it would cost him personally. And a man in his position would know exactly what it would cost, which meant either he didn't care or the cost was one he had already decided was worth it. She didn't know which of those possibilities frightened her more. The hall emptied in stages, the way halls do after something irreversible has been said inside them. Clusters of nobles drifting into antechambers, voices dropping, alliances recalculating in real time. Lyanna moved with the guard contingent toward the eastern corridor, not running, not hurrying, holding the pace of someone who has not just had their life reorganized in public. She made it to the third corridor before the footsteps behind her accelerated. "Lyanna," she turned. Darius was alone. He had shed his escort, which meant he had chosen this, which meant she was about to receive the version of him that existed without an audience. She waited. "I didn't know he was going to do that," Darius said. "I believe you." He registered this. Not the comfort of being believed, but the quiet devastation of the way she had said it, without any particular heat. This is going to be a political catastrophe, he said. Kalen can't just... He can, apparently, she said. Your father confirmed it. My father... He stopped. A vein in his jaw was visible. He's been waiting for something, some provocation. Tonight gave it to him. You're angry, she said. Yes, I'm angry. He humiliated me in front of... He cited a legal clause that you knew existed and declared for a woman you chose not to claim, Lyanna said. I understand that feels like humiliation. I understand that from where you're standing, the distinction is fine. But I want to be precise about the sequence of events, Darius, because I think precision matters here. She held his gaze. You chose Seraphine. He chose me. Those are two men making two different decisions. Only one of you will spend the rest of his life understanding what that cost. She didn't wait for him to answer. She turned and walked, and he let her go. Because Darius, for all his limitations, was not a man who couldn't read a closed door. And she made it to the outer corridor before something in her chest finally gave way, just barely, just enough for the trembling in her hands to become visible. She pressed her back against the stone wall, cold through the uniform. She breathed. She did not cry. She was not built for public crying, had learned young that tears in this place were read as weakness, and weakness invited a particular kind of attention she could not afford, but she let herself feel the full dimension of what had just happened. The rupture, the strange free-fall quality of a world that had reorganized without asking her permission. And she was still standing there working through it, when she heard unhurried footsteps coming from the north end of the corridor. Lyanna Vale rounded the corner alone. No escort, no guards. A king in a black uniform walking a corridor at night like a man who had simply decided to walk it, which told her something about the quality of his confidence that she didn't yet have language for. He stopped when he saw her, not in surprise, in recognition. You weren't supposed to be in this corridor, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved. No, he said. Neither were you. He was closer now than he had been across the hall, close enough that she could see his eyes clearly. Dark, not quite black, the color of deep water. There was a small scar along the left side of his jaw that she hadn't noticed before. It had healed badly, which meant it had healed in the field. Why did you do that? She said. Not a question exactly, more like a beginning. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in the quality of his stillness that was different from Darius's stillness. Darius went still when he was avoiding something. Kalen went still like someone who was simply not in a hurry, like someone who had learned that time moves at the same pace regardless of how anxiously you face it. Because it was the truth, he said. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have right now. He paused. I have watched this court treat you as a category error for a decade. That is accurate language for it. Not a person who failed, but a person who could not be filed correctly, and so was filed nowhere. She felt something in her face she couldn't fully control. You were watching. I was watching. Why? A beat. Because you kept showing up, he said. After every piece of it, every ceremony where you stood in the wrong place, every training session where they measured you against a standard designed to exclude you, every year of being exactly adjacent to being valued without being valued. You kept showing up anyway. I didn't have anywhere else to go, she said. That's not why, he said. People with nowhere else to go disappear. They get smaller, or they get mean, or they stop trying. You didn't do any of those things? He looked at her with that steady, specific quality. I wanted to know why. The corridor was cold and quiet. Somewhere in the citadel above them, she could hear the distant sound of the ceremony dissolving into the nighttime routines of the imperial household. Doors, footsteps, the particular silence that follows a public event when the people who attended it begin processing what they witnessed. I don't know you, she said. I know. I don't trust you. That's correct, he said. You shouldn't, not yet. Then why are we standing in a corridor at night having a conversation that suggests otherwise? Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. Something more controlled and more real. Because in approximately 4 minutes, he said, the Duke Draven's household captain is going to appear at the south end of this corridor with 3 men, and you need to be somewhere else before that happens. Her attention sharpened completely. How do you know that? Because I know Draven, he said. And because I made a very significant public statement about your status tonight, and Draven is not a man who adjusts quietly." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to move." She looked at him. She looked at the south end of the corridor. She made a decision, not because she trusted him, because she had spent 10 years making survival decisions in environments that required her to be faster than the people who meant her harm, and every instinct she had trained across those 10 years was pointing in the same direction. "Where?" she said. "The King's Wing," he said. The corridor was silent for a moment. "That will cause more problems than it solves," she said. "Yes," he said. "It will also mean you're alive to have those problems." From the south end of the corridor, very faint, the sound of a door. Lyanna Vale made a decision, and for the first time in 10 years it was not a decision about surviving inside a framework that had been built to exclude her. It was something else entirely. She moved. And as she and Kaelin Valor disappeared into the northern passage, the three men from House Draven rounded the south corner into an empty corridor, finding nothing but cold stone and torchlight. And on the floor where she had been standing, a single blood-stained piece of training wrap that had come loose from her wrist. One of the men picked it up. He looked at the captain. "Duke Draven is not going to like this," the captain said. He was right, but what none of them knew, what even Lyanna did not know yet, as she moved through the dark corridors of the King's Wing toward a life she had not planned and had not been asked about, was that the story that was beginning tonight was not a story about whether a king could claim a woman the Empire had already decided was worthless. It was a story about what happens when the thing an empire decided was worthless turns out to have been something else all along. Something ancient, something sleeping, something that, in the space of one night, had just opened its eyes. The northern passage of the Imperial Citadel was a different country from the ceremonial halls. No torches and silver brackets here. No marble inlaid with the Valor crest, just raw black stone that had been quarried from the mountain beneath the citadel 300 years ago and never dressed up for company. Corridors lit by oil lamps at long intervals that threw more shadow than light. And the particular silence of a place that had decided a long time ago it was not interested in being impressive. Lyanna moved fast, keeping pace with Kaelin's stride, listening behind them. The sound of the Draven men in the south corridor had not followed. Either they had not picked up the direction quickly enough, or, and this was the thought she kept returning to, Kaelin had been so precise in his timing that there had been nothing to follow. That kind of precision required either very good intelligence or a very long habit of reading situations before they fully developed. Either way, it told her something. "How far?" she said. 2 minutes, he said. "You walked this route before tonight." "Several times." She filed that away. A king who personally walks secondary corridors of his own citadel is either paranoid or meticulous, or both. In her experience, those qualities lived close together in men who had held power long enough to understand what it actually cost. They came through a low archway and into a wider corridor she recognized from the citadel's general layout, the north residential wing, which housed the king's private apartments. She had never been in this section. The guard rotation she worked did not cover it. A door at the end. 2 guards flanking it who saw Kaelin coming and straightened to absolute attention without being given an order. One of them looked at Lyanna with the flat professional non-expression of someone trained to register information without reacting to it. Kaelin opened the door himself. He held it and looked at her. She stood outside it. "If I walk through that door," she said, "this becomes a different kind of conversation." "Yes," he said. "The court will have an opinion about it by morning. The court already has several opinions about tonight. One more won't significantly change the architecture." She looked at him. He looked back. No pressure in it. That was the specific thing she noticed. Another man in his position, a man who had just made a very public claim and was now standing at the door of his private residence, would have exerted some kind of forward gravity. Darius would have smiled. Darius would have reached for her arm. Most men she had met in this court would have found some way to make the choice feel smaller than it was, to make her feel like it had already been made. Kaelin simply held the door open and waited, and the waiting was genuine, which was more unsettling than pressure would have been. She walked through. The king's antechamber was not what she expected, and she would realize later that her expectation said more about the assumptions she had accumulated from a decade of living adjacent to Darius than it said about Kaelin. She had expected the aesthetic of power performed: heavy furniture, display weapons, the specific visual vocabulary of a man who needed a room to confirm his importance. What she found instead was a working space. A long table covered in maps with handwritten annotations in 2 different inks, the older layer so worn it had nearly blended into the paper. A wall rack of correspondence sorted in tight rolls. A fireplace with a single chair pulled close to it, and a cup of something on the side table that had gone cold. He had been called away from it tonight before he could finish it. Bookshelves with actual use wear on the spines. No decorations except one. A topographic rendering of the Empire's eastern border in cast iron hung above the fireplace, all ridge lines and river markers, the kind of map a military man would find useful rather than beautiful. She stood in the middle of it and oriented herself. Kaelin closed the door. He crossed to the fireplace and added 2 pieces of wood from the stack beside it without asking her anything. The fire caught, and the room warmed by several degrees. He turned. "Sit down if you want." "I'll stand." "That's fine." He didn't sit either. He moved to the table and looked at something in the correspondence pile, which told her he was giving her space. Deliberate space, engineered to feel casual. She recognized the technique because she had used it herself 100 times in rooms where someone else needed to not feel cornered. She said, "Tell me what tonight cost you." He looked up. "Not what you're willing to tell me," she said. "What it actually cost. I spent 10 years inside a court that treated me like furniture, and I got very good at understanding the difference between what people say and what is operationally true. So, a beat. The council will convene tomorrow," he said. "There are 3 noble houses who will read tonight as destabilization and begin having conversations with each other about what that means for their interests. Duke Draven will file a formal challenge to the compact citation within 48 hours, which means the Imperial Senate becomes involved and my father will have to spend political capital defending it." He paused. "Darius is going to be very difficult for approximately the next 6 months. And?" He looked at her with something that was close to respect and not quite there yet, still its own earlier form, the thing that exists before you've confirmed the accuracy of your assessment of someone. "And there are people within my father's court who have been waiting for evidence that I am capable of making decisions driven by something other than strategic logic," he said. "Tonight handed them that evidence." "You made yourself look like you acted on impulse," she said. "I made myself look like I acted on feeling, which is not the same thing, but to most of the people in that room the distinction doesn't exist." "Was it impulse?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. The fire had settled into a steady burn and the room had found a new temperature, not quite comfortable but close. "No," he said. She waited. "I have been watching what this court does to you for a long time," he said. "I made a decision about tonight before tonight arrived." The sentence landed with a specific gravity. She let it sit. "You planned it," she said. "I had a contingency," he said, "for a certain kind of outcome. Darius selecting Seraphine Draven was the likely outcome. The Duke has been engineering it for 2 years, and Darius is not a man who fights his own comfort." He said it without contempt, just precision. "If that outcome occurred, the compact citation was available. I had confirmed the legal basis 3 days ago." She stared at him. There's a specific disorientation that occurs when you discover that a decision which felt, in the moment of its execution, like an act of spontaneous courage was actually a calculated one. It does not necessarily reduce the weight of it. A man who prepares to do a brave thing and then does it has still done it. But it changes the texture. It moves the event from the category of impulse, which can be later reconsidered, into the category of intention, which cannot. Kaelin Valor had intended this. 3 days before tonight, he had confirmed the legal foundation, which meant he had been watching for long enough and with enough seriousness to have sought legal confirmation. "Why?" she said. "Not the political answer, the actual one." He looked at her across the table and the map of the eastern border and the cold cup of whatever he had been drinking before the ceremony pulled him away. "'Cause some things are worth doing precisely because they're inconvenient," he said. Because I have spent 16 years running an empire and making every decision by the logic of what an empire requires, and I have gotten very good at it, and I have lost certain things in the process that I cannot entirely identify, but that I am aware of their absence. He stopped. And because you have been standing in the margins of this court for 10 years with your hands split and your chin up, and you have not broken, and I have watched that, and I did not want to be the man who noticed and did nothing. No. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the citadel, a door closed. Footsteps moved across the ceiling. She said, "You don't know me." "I know the outline," he said. "I don't know the interior." That's the difference between what tonight was and what it wasn't. Tonight was the outline. I'm not pretending it was more. She had expected many things from this conversation. She had expected some version of political justification, or the specific performance of gallantry that powerful men offered women they had decided to acquire. She had not expected this. A man who described the limits of his own action with the same accuracy he described everything else. This was, she understood, either the most sophisticated form of manipulation she had ever encountered, or something else entirely. She was not yet positioned to know which. What she knew was that she was standing in a king's private rooms after midnight, while the empire sorted through the wreckage of his public decision, and she was not afraid. And that particular absence of fear was its own information worth examining. There is a specific psychology to men who claim, not the taking is animal and simple, but the claiming, the public declaration of value in a context where the act of declaration has cost. What drives a man of Lyanna Vale's position and discipline to that kind of exposure? The easy answer is desire. The court would say desire, would say the king has found a woman who ignited something and acted on it. And this is the kind of story courts like because it is simple, and because it places the woman at the center of the man's motivation in a way that keeps her legible. But desire alone does not produce legal research 3 days in advance. What produces that is something older and more structural, the particular frustration of a man who has operated for too long in a world that rewards silence about the things that matter. Lyanna had ruled an empire by the logic of what an empire required, and he was excellent at it, and he had paid for that excellence in ways he could measure only by the shape of what was missing. He had watched Lyanna Vale for years, not because she was beautiful, though she was, and not because she was skilled, though she was that too, but because she represented a quality of refusal he recognized and had spent too long suppressing in himself. She refused to disappear. In a court designed to make her invisible, she kept being present, not loudly, not with the desperate performance of someone fighting for attention, just persistently, continuously, stubbornly there. Showing up for drills, showing up for duty rotations, showing up to stand in the margins of every ceremony where she was technically required and socially unwelcome. This is not a small thing. This is in fact exactly the thing that separates the people who survive long-term difficulty from the people who don't. The ones who survive are rarely the ones who fight hardest in any single moment. They're the ones who have found some private reason to keep returning that does not depend on external validation, because the external validation has been reliably unavailable. Lyanna understood this because he had been running on that same fuel for 16 years. And the thing about recognizing that quality in someone else is that it produces a kind of pull that is not romantic in its origin, but becomes indistinguishable from it over time, because you cannot be drawn to a quality in someone without being drawn to the person who carries it. Tonight, he had stopped pretending he wasn't. She was still standing when the knock came, not tentative, the specific 3-beat knock of someone withstanding. Lyanna said, "Come." The door opened and a man entered that Lyanna recognized. Commander Aldrich Vane, head of the king's personal intelligence unit, a dry-faced man of 50 who wore authority the way old wood wears age, so completely integrated there was no separating it. He registered Lyanna with exactly one adjustment of his eyes and then moved on. "Draven's man filed a formal objection with the Knight Chancellor 20 minutes ago," he said. "They're citing procedural irregularity in the compact citation." "On what grounds?" Lyanna said. "They're arguing the compact's informal standing clause applies only to formally recognized household members, not to members of the General Guard who have had personal proximity to a prince. And the distinction they're drawing, that personal proximity without formal household designation doesn't qualify. Kalen was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of stillness she was beginning to recognize as his processing mode. Not absence, full presence in the problem, just not announced. Pull the Castalian precedent from the 3rd century, he said. The Mara Castalian case. A guard officer was granted informal standing through consistent personal attendance at a royal function for a period of greater than 7 years. No formal household designation. The compact was upheld. He paused. Have it on the Chancellor's desk before the first bell. Already pulled, Vane said. He glanced at Lyanna again. There's a second issue. Say it. Lady Seraphine has requested a private audience with the Emperor for tomorrow morning, through her father's household, not through the Crown Prince. Kalen looked at the correspondence rack. Something in his face settled. She's separating herself from Darius already, Lyanna said. Both men looked at her. If she goes through Draven's household rather than Darius's, she's signaling to the Emperor that her father's political position is independent of the Crown Prince. Which means if tonight's decision stands and Darius loses face over it, she doesn't go down with him. She looked at Kalen. She's positioning for multiple outcomes. Vane looked at Kalen with the expression of someone recalibrating. Kalen said, Yes. She's smarter than Darius, Lyanna said. Considerably, Kalen said. Which makes her more dangerous than Duke Draven, because Draven operates by force and Seraphine operates by patience. He turned to Vane. The Emperor's morning schedule. I'll manage it, Vane said, and the Draven guards that were in the North Corridor tonight. Vane's expression shifted slightly. He had known about that. Relocated. Make sure they understand the relocation is permanent. A beat. Yes, Your Majesty. Vane looked at Lyanna one final time. Not unkindly, but with the precision of a man filing information accurately. Then he left and closed the door. Lyanna said, He already knew I was here. Vane knows everything that happens in this citadel within 20 minutes of it happening, Kalen said. It's what I pay him for. And you're comfortable with that. I'm comfortable with it because I don't have anything to be uncomfortable about. What I did tonight is what I intended to do. There's no version of it I'm trying to hide from my own intelligence commander. She looked at him. Most men in your position would at least perform discomfort about having a woman in their rooms at midnight. Would you prefer I perform it? No. Then we agree. He moved toward the chair by the fire. Not sitting. He stopped beside it, turned, leaned one shoulder against the stone of the fireplace. The posture was the first genuinely unguarded thing she had seen from him. Not calculated ease, actual tiredness, end of a long day tiredness, the specific kind that doesn't show in the body until the room is small enough that there's no reason to hold it off. She noticed it and said nothing. You should sleep, he said. The room at the end of this corridor has been kept for a guest. It locks from the inside. You expected me to be here tonight. I expected either you or a significant political problem, he said. Usually those things arrive together. Tonight they're the same thing, so... He gestured toward the corridor. She didn't move yet. I have questions. I'm sure you do. Not tonight, she said, because I'm not going to get the full answers tonight, and I would rather have all of them at once than collect them in pieces. She looked at him directly. But I want you to understand that the fact that I'm in this wing is a survival decision, not a declaration of anything else. I understand that, and that I am not going to be managed. Something moved in his face. Real, this time. Not a smile, but its predecessor. I would not, he said, know where to start. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned and walked toward the corridor. She was almost at the door when he said quietly, Lyanna. She stopped. Didn't turn. The compact clause I cited tonight, he said. It doesn't expire. What was declared in that hall tonight cannot be undeclared by a Senate vote or a Duke's objection. The only person who can release it is you. She stood with her back to him and the fire and the map of the eastern border. I know, she said. She walked out. The guest room was exactly as described. Simple, cold until the small hearth caught, a lock on the door that was solid iron and newer than the rest of the hardware in the room, as if it had been replaced recently and specifically. She noted that. She noted the window's position relative to the courtyard below. She noted the secondary door on the east wall that opened, when she checked it, into a small washroom. She noted all of these things the way she had been trained to note them: exit points, sight lines, proximity to the corridor. And then she sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands, not crying. She already knew she wasn't going to cry. But the architecture of the night needed somewhere to land, and this was the first room she had been in since the ceremony where nobody was watching and nothing was required of her, and so she sat with it. The ceremony. Darius's face when he said Seraphine's name. The particular quality of the hall's silence when Kaelin spoke. The three Draven men in the corridor finding empty stone, and the conversation in the antechamber. The map. The cold cup. The way he had said, "I did not want to be the man who noticed and did nothing." She lifted her head. The window showed a sky moving toward its deep middle hour, the space between midnight and dawn when the dark is complete and the citadel is as close to quiet as it ever gets. Below, the courtyard was empty. One guard walking a perimeter route, torch in hand, unaware of anything that had happened in the Hall of Moons tonight, doing his rotation the same way he did it every other night. She watched him until he disappeared around the north corner. Then she pulled off her gloves and looked at her hands. The wrap on her right knuckles had come loose at some point. She had noticed the piece falling in the corridor and had not stopped to retrieve it, too focused on the footsteps behind them. The split skin had dried. It would be stiff tomorrow. She rewrapped it from the kit in her uniform pocket, tight and even, the mechanical rhythm of it something her hands knew without requiring her attention. She had done this so many times that it required no thought. That was the thing about physical training. It gave you something to do with your hands when your mind was doing something too large to approach directly. What was too large to approach directly tonight was the possibility, not a certainty, not yet anywhere near a certainty, that the story she had been living in for 10 years had been the wrong one, that she had arranged her life around a center that was always going to collapse, and something outside the arrangement had known this before she did, had been watching the collapse developing from a distance, and had made a contingency. For her. 3 days ago. She finished rewrapping her hand. She lay back on the bed without removing her uniform and stared at the ceiling of black stone. She was 31 years old, and she had never in her life had anyone make a contingency for her. She did not know what to do with that. She did not have a category for it. She lay there in the dark and turned it over and could not find the familiar ground of it anywhere. And after a long time she closed her eyes, not sleeping, just holding the strangeness of being somewhere unexpected and finding it, despite everything, less hostile than where she had come from. Mote. She woke at the fourth bell by instinct, which was when she always woke, and lay still for 3 seconds to orient before remembering. The room, the citadel's north wing, the sound of the fire having gone to embers. She was on her feet and at the door in under a minute. The corridor was empty. The citadel had the specific silence of deep night, that held breath quality just before the first kitchen staff began their work. She moved toward the antechamber. The door was ajar. Firelight through the gap. She pushed it open. Kaelin was at the table. He had changed from the formal uniform into something simpler. Dark shirt, no insignia. And he was working through correspondence, and he looked up when she entered with the complete alertness of someone who had not been sleeping. "You haven't slept," she said. "I don't sleep much." She crossed the room to the table and looked at the documents spread across it, not reading them, not her place, not yet, just registering the volume. Dispatches, by the look of them, border reports, at least 3 in what she recognized as the cipher format the Eastern Command used. "Something happened," she said. He looked at her, that assessment quality again, calibrating how much to say. "Kaelin," she said, "I was a threat analyst for 2 years in the Eastern Guard, before Darius requested my transfer back to the Citadel. I know what a border dispatch looks like when it's urgent." A beat of silence. "The Ashfeld Pass," he said. "There's been movement. 3 divisions of Morthian infantry repositioning toward the northern approach. They started moving 48 hours ago." She felt the information land and immediately begin reorganizing other things around it. 48 hours ago is before tonight." "Yes." So whoever ordered that movement knew, or expected, that the Empire would be politically destabilized by something happening in this citadel around this time. He looked at her. "Draven," she said. "That's the working premise. He has communication lines into Morthia. He has family into Morthia. His wife's brother commands the Morthian Second Army. She stared at him. Duke Draven is coordinating a foreign military movement timed to a domestic succession crisis. That is what the last 3 hours of dispatches suggest, Kaelin said. The weight of it settled across the room like something physical. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, without asking. He registered this and did not comment. Show me the disposition maps, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something was being decided. Please, she said. Not soft, just accurate. I can read them. And right now you are sitting alone with dispatches that require more than one set of eyes, and whatever tonight was or wasn't, I am still a trained analyst, and you are still someone who needs to not be alone with this information at the fourth bell. Kaelin held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he reached across the table and spread the eastern border map between them, and she leaned forward, and for the next hour they worked through it together without ceremony or pretense or any of the complicated architecture of what else was true about this night. Just 2 people who were good at a specific thing being good at it in the same room. It was, she would think later, the most honest thing that had happened to her inside the Imperial Citadel in 10 years. Dawn was beginning to find the edges of the high windows when Kaelin set down his pen and said, The Senate session is at midday. Draven will move the formal challenge then. And the Morthian repositioning? My field commander has orders. He's watching but not engaging. He looked at the map. If Draven has coordinated this, then the challenge in the Senate is the distraction. The real question is what he moves against while we're focused on procedure. She looked at the eastern border, at the 3 Morthian divisions, at the pass. He needs the Senate to invalidate tonight, she said. Not just for the succession. If tonight's claim stands, his daughter's position is permanently secondary. He cannot afford that. No. So the challenge is real. He will push it. Yes. And if he loses the challenge in the Senate? Kaelin's jaw set. Then we find out what the Morthian divisions are actually for. She looked at him across the map of the Empire. In the early gray light of a morning that had already decided it was going to be significant, and she felt the specific sensation of a door closing behind her, not with violence, not with drama, but with the quiet finality of a latch catching. She had walked out of one life last night. She had not expected to walk into anything this large this quickly. She had not expected to find, sitting across a table covered in urgent dispatches, a man who spread the maps toward her without being asked and waited for her to read them and said nothing about what she was or wasn't, only what she could do. She had not expected that. And the part of her that had spent 10 years building walls against exactly this kind of rearrangement felt the structure shift, not collapsing, not gone, but no longer holding the same shape it had held yesterday. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask. The claim you made tonight, under the compact. She held his gaze. Was any part of it about Darius? The question was precise, and she meant it precisely. She needed to know if she was a move in a sibling rivalry before she went any further in any direction. Kaelin looked at her without looking away. Darius was the mechanism, not the reason. Say the difference clearly. If Darius had claimed you tonight, he said, I would have let it go. I would not have been happy about it. But I would have let it go because it was his right and because I am not a man who starts wars over personal interest. He paused. When he chose not to, When he chose Seraphine in front of the whole empire and left you standing in the left wing in a gray uniform, that was the moment I was not willing to do nothing. Not because of him, because of you. She looked at him. That's the difference, he said. She held it, turned it over, looked for the seam where the calculated answer would show through the honest one. She couldn't find it. Outside, the citadel was beginning to wake, the kitchen bells, the change of guard rotation, the Empire's daily machinery starting its movement, unaware that by midday it would be asked to rule on whether last night had happened correctly. Lyanna Vale sat across from the King of Varenth in the early morning with border dispatches between them and a Senate challenge 3 hours away, and she thought, everything I know how to do, I learned in the margins. I learned it without resources, and without backing, and without anyone who had my name in their contingency plan. She thought, I do not know if I can trust this man. She thought, I do not know if trust is even the right category for what is being asked of me. And then the door to the antechamber opened without a knock, which meant only one person, and Commander Vane entered with the expression of a man carrying information that has already made the decisions for everyone in the room. "The Senate session has been moved," he said. "Not by Draven." Kaelin looked up. "By whom?" "By the Emperor." Vane set a sealed document on the table. The wax bore the imperial crest, not the standard administrative seal, the personal one. "He's convening a full imperial assembly, not a Senate session. Full assembly. Every house, every commander, the civilian councils." He paused. "He's scheduled it for tonight." The room was very still. "He's going to make it formal," Kaelin said quietly. Not a question. "He's going to put the claim to the full assembly for either ratification or rejection," Vane said. "Which means by tomorrow morning, every power in this empire will have voted on whether what happened in that hall last night stands." He looked at Lyanna with something that was not quite apology and not quite warning. "And whether she does." Lyanna looked at the imperial seal on the document. She looked at the border dispatches beneath it. She looked at the man across the table who had made a contingency 3 days ago and confirmed legal foundations and still could not have planned for this. For an emperor calling a full assembly at dawn, for a Morthian army repositioning at a border, for the convergence of all of it in the space of a single night. She thought, "I came through that door as a survival decision." She thought, "What happens tonight is not a survival decision anymore. What happens tonight will determine whether an empire decides she has the right to exist inside it at all." And for the first time in 10 years, she would not be standing in the margins when it voted. She would be standing at the center. And across the empire, in border fortresses and Morthian war camps and the private chambers of a duke who had spent 2 years building a future that had just been complicated, people who had never once thought of Lyanna Vale as anything worth planning for were beginning, in the cold clarity of morning, to understand that they had made a significant error of assessment. She was not a woman with no wolf. She was a woman they had never bothered to look at directly. And the difference between those two things was about to cost someone everything. The Imperial Assembly did not convene in the Hall of Moons. It convened in the throne chamber, which was a different kind of room entirely. Older, larger, built during the first century of the Empire when the founders were still making architectural decisions based on intimidation rather than beauty. The ceiling was 40 feet of black vaulted stone. The floor was pale granite worn smooth by 300 years of boots and knees. The throne itself was not decorative, a single high-backed seat of iron and dark wood, functional to the point of severity, positioned on a raised dais at the north end so that everyone who entered the room entered already at a lower elevation than the man who sat in it. Emperor Kaelin had chosen this room deliberately, which told Lyanna something about what he intended tonight to mean. She was given 2 hours to prepare, which was the kind of preparation time that assumed you had things to prepare with. She had the uniform on her back and the re-wrapped knuckles and the particular quality of focus she had developed over 10 years of walking into rooms where she was not wanted and refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching her stumble. Commander Vane had sent a woman to the guest room, a quiet, precise person named Asha, who worked the king's household staff and who arrived with a formal imperial uniform in Lyanna's size, gray and silver, bearing no house crest, which was both accurate and a statement. When Lyanna looked at her, Asha said simply, "His Majesty's instruction. Dress as what you are, not what they want to argue about." She had left it at that, and Lyanna had put the uniform on and stood in the small mirror above the washroom basin and looked at herself for exactly long enough to confirm that she was still there, still intact, and then she was done looking. Kaelin was waiting in the corridor. He had changed into the Iron Wolf formal uniform, black with the commander's chain, and he looked the way he always looked, like a man who had already made peace with whatever the room was going to do. He looked at her once, fully, the assessment she was learning to recognize. "Ready?" she said. Not a question. "There's something you should know before we go in," he said. She waited. "My father convened this assembly in part because he wants the record to be unambiguous," he said. "If the full assembly ratifies tonight, no Senate challenge from Draven can undo it. The precedent becomes institutional. And if they don't ratify, then the compact citation is voided, the claim is dissolved, and you return to your previous posting as though last night didn't happen." He held her gaze. "The assembly has that authority." "I know. I want you to hear it directly, not from Vane, not from procedure. From me." He paused. "If they vote against, I will not be able to stop the consequence. She looked at him steadily. I've been living inside consequences. Nobody could stop my whole life. That part isn't new. Something shifted in his face, not softening, deepening. Let's go, she said. Cool. The assembly chamber was full. Not ceremonially full, the arranged fullness of events designed for display. Actually full. The crowded, uncomfortable fullness of every power in the empire summoned on 6 hours' notice and arriving still pulling on their formal dress. House commanders in military uniform, council heads in administrative gray. The civilian councils from the major cities, most of them looking like they hadn't slept. Minor house representatives crushed into the galleries above. And at the front, in the positioned chairs that indicated primary standing in the assembly, Duke Draven, in house colors of deep red and gold, seated with the composed deliberateness of a man who had spent the night deciding this room was already his. To his left, Lady Seraphine, dressed with the calculated simplicity of someone who had understood before dawn that the optics of excess were the wrong move today. Darius stood to the right of the throne dais with his household. He did not look at Lyanna when she entered. He looked at the floor, then at the far wall, and the specific geometry of his not looking was louder than anything he could have said. Lyanna walked with the Citadel Guard contingent to the left wall. Same position as last night, different room. Kaelin took his position to the right of the Emperor's chair. Emperor Kaelin entered last, carried on the formal chair, and the room organized itself into silence with practiced speed. The old man looked at the assembled empire for a long moment. He had the eyes of someone who had watched rooms like this for 60 years and found them, by now, fairly predictable. We are not here to debate what was said last night, he said. His voice was thin but carried. That record is clear. We are here because the law requires confirmation at this scale for a claim of this standing, and because I have spent 60 years building an empire that runs on law rather than convenience, and I do not intend to stop now because it's inconvenient. He looked at Draven. The floor is open for objection before the vote. Draven rose. He was a large man who used his size with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned early that physical presence is a political tool. He moved to the center of the floor with the unhurried confidence of a man who had spent 2 years building toward this moment and believed, as of this morning, that he was still winning. Your Imperial Majesty, he said, with respect to the throne and to the compact, the citation made last night fails on the question of standing. The woman in question holds no bloodline position, no house affiliation, no wolf designation, and no formal household role within the imperial family. The compact's informal standing clause was written to protect members of noble households who had been informally promised by a royal family member. It was not written to apply to Imperial Guard personnel on the basis of personal proximity. He turned slightly, just enough to indicate Lyanna without looking directly at her. The rhetorical move of a man who wanted to reference her as a category rather than a person. Furthermore, the standing of a wolfless individual within any formal imperial compact is itself legally contested under the Bloodline Confirmation Acts of the 2nd century, which require any individual entering a bond with the imperial family to demonstrate active wolf designation. He sat. The room processed this. The murmur was low and technical, which was worse than heated. It meant people were calculating rather than reacting, and calculation was what Draven was good at. Kaelin remained still. Lyanna remained still. The Emperor looked at his son. Response. Kaelin said, the Castalian precedent of the 3rd century, which Commander Vane submitted to the Chancellor this morning, addresses the standing question directly. An Imperial Guard officer of no house affiliation was granted informal standing through consistent personal attendance to a royal function over a period greater than 7 years. The compact was upheld by a full assembly vote by a margin of 2-1. He paused. As to the Bloodline Confirmation Acts, Duke Draven is citing the 2nd century text. The acts were substantially revised in the 4th century, specifically to remove the wolf designation requirement for imperial bonds, because the original text had created succession crises in 3 separate reigns by excluding individuals whose wolves had been late to present or had never presented. The revision is explicit. The current law does not require active wolf designation. Draven said without rising, the revision is disputed. It was disputed in the 4th century, Kaelin said. It was resolved in the 4th century. The assembly at that time voted to confirm the revision by the largest margin in recorded assembly history. A beat. 40 years of legal consensus does not become disputed because it's inconvenient today. The murmur in the room shifted register. Kaelin had done what good advocates do. He had named the move. He had said inconvenient and let it land, and now every person in the room was aware that what was being debated was not strictly legal, but at least partly political. Draven's jaw was visible from where Lyanna stood. There is something particular about the moment in a public proceeding when the legal argument exhausts itself, and what remains is the nakedness of raw position. Every assembly, every council, every formal body that has ever convened to decide something that matters eventually reaches that point. The point where the citations are spent, and what is left is simply the question of who has more to lose by the outcome. These moments are the most honest ones in any political process, and also the most brutal, because they strip away the pretense that procedure is about justice and reveal what it has always partly been about: the specific interests of the specific people in the room and how those interests align with or against the available outcomes. Lyanna had spent 2 years doing threat assessment for the Eastern Guard, and she understood this with the clarity of someone who had watched it happen at the scale of military operations. An army does not advance because the moral argument is sound. It advances because the cost of not advancing has become higher than the cost of movement. The Assembly of the Empire of Varanth was about to vote on her existence within its formal structure, and the vote would be determined not by the Castalian precedent or the 4th century revision, but by the calculation each house made about what a yes or no cost them personally. She was 31 years old, and her entire life had been a practice in being on the wrong side of that calculation. She stood against the left wall and held her spine level and thought, "This is the ground you've always stood on. You know this ground. You know how to stand on it." It did not make her feel better. It made her feel accurate, which was a different and in some ways harder thing. The Chancellor called the vote by house. It was done by standing. Those in favor of ratification stood, those against remained seated, which was a more exposed format than ballot, and Emperor Kaelin had specified it deliberately because he wanted the record to show exactly who stood where, literally. The first 3 houses stood in favor, the 4th remained seated, the 5th stood. Lyanna tracked it with the part of her brain that ran counts without being asked, the same part that tracked opponents in a training yard. By the midpoint, she had the shape of it, not a landslide in either direction, a contested vote, close enough that the remaining houses could feel the weight of their choice before they made it. Then a house she had not expected, one of the border houses, old military stock, no obvious alignment with Draven, sat when they should have stood, and the count tightened in a way that changed the texture of the room. Draven was watching the count with the expression of a man who knows something about the architecture of the floor he's standing on. Lyanna felt the shift before she identified it. Something in the patterning was wrong, not wrong in the way of a close but honest vote, wrong in the way of a result that has been worked on in advance. The count closed. The Chancellor conferred with the senior recorder. "The Assembly vote," the Chancellor said, and the room went absolutely still, "stands at 41 in favor of ratification, 43 opposed. The compact citation is not confirmed by Assembly vote." A beat of silence with weight in it. Then the room reorganized itself into 2 separate kinds of noise. The noise of people who had won something, and the noise of people who had lost something. The second was quieter and more specific. Draven rose. He did not smile. He was too intelligent for visible satisfaction in a room this watched. He simply stood with the gravity of a man collecting what was owed. "Under Assembly authority," he said, "I move that the claim made last night be formally voided." "Seconded," said 2 voices simultaneously. "Prepared." "Pre-arranged." Emperor Kaelin looked at Kaelin. Kaelin was very still. Lyanna watched him and understood, from the specific quality of his stillness. Not the processing stillness she had learned to read across the table this morning, but a different kind, the stillness of someone registering something they had not fully accounted for, that the count had not gone the way his intelligence had told him it would. Someone had moved votes. After Vane's information last night, between midnight and this morning, someone had worked the floor. The Emperor said, "The motion passes." His voice was entirely without expression, which told her he was furious in the precise and contained way of a man who will spend the next 48 hours identifying exactly what had gone wrong and making adjustments accordingly. "The claim is voided." The room breathed, and Lyanna Vale stood against the left wall of the throne chamber and felt the particular sensation she had felt once before, when she was 9 years old and had read the document that described her as survived by one minor daughter. The sensation of being accurately assessed by a structure too large to argue with. She had been here before. She would not collapse in it. The corridor outside the throne chamber was briefly chaotic, with the movement of an assembly dissolving, House representatives consolidating into clusters, the immediate work of allegiance realignment beginning in whispered consultations against walls. Lyanna moved with the Citadel Guard contingent until they reached the first junction, and then she stopped, because continuing to move with a group that was dispersing back to routines that no longer included her felt like the wrong kind of motion. She stood at the junction and waited. Kaelin found her in 3 minutes. He stopped beside her, not in front of, not blocking, just beside. And they stood in the moving corridor for a moment without speaking. "3 votes, she said. "Yes." "Someone moved them between last night and this morning." "Yes." "Who?" His jaw was set. She had not seen his face like this before. Not closed off, not controlled, something beneath the control that was actively working to stay below the surface. "I don't know yet," he said. "Vane is—" "I need you to say the true version," she said. "Not the version where you don't know yet. The version where you have a working hypothesis and you're deciding how much to give me." He looked at her, fully. "Darius," he said. The word landed. She had known it before he said it. She had known it from the moment she identified the pattern of the vote. The specific houses that had turned were houses that had long-standing personal relationships with the Crown Prince, not with Draven. They were not Draven's votes. They were Darius's. "He spent the night working the floor," she said. Not a question. "That is the hypothesis. To protect Seraphine's position, to void my claim," Kaelin said, and something in the word might had an edge that was not political. "They are different motivations. He didn't do this for Seraphine. He did it because I acted, and he could not tolerate the specific version of what my acting meant." She understood this too. Darius had not claimed her, had been the man who did not claim her, who chose someone else in front of everyone. And then his brother had stepped into that vacancy, and the public record of his choice had become permanently legible as the smaller one. The only way to make that record less visible was to unmake the thing that created the contrast. Darius had not spent a sleepless night of political work to protect Seraphine or to advance Draven's agenda. He had done it to make himself feel, in the morning, like less of a smaller man. She had spent 10 years loving him, and she felt now only the exhausted precision of seeing him completely. "He knew," she said. "He knew what voting that way would mean for me." "Yes," Kaelin said. "He knew." The corridor had thinned. A few guards, a cluster of minor house staff at the far end. The sounds of the assembly's aftermath were already receding into the Citadel's normal noise. "I have to leave the King's Wing," she said. "Lyanna, the claim is voided. I have no standing to be housed in your residential corridor, and if I stay there it gives Draven a procedural argument for improper influence on the assembly, and you don't need that right now. I'm not asking you to leave." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you the logic." He was quiet. She could see him working through the same logic and arriving at the same place. "Where will you go?" he said. "Back to the guard barracks," she said. "My posting hasn't changed. I'm still a member of the Citadel Guard. The vote tonight didn't touch that." She looked at him. "I'm good at continuing to exist in situations that have decided I'm invisible. I've had a lot of practice." Something moved in his face that she did not have language for yet. "This isn't finished," he said. "I know that too." Draven moved 3 votes with 12 hours of work. That is not the action of a man who is confident in the durability of his position. It's the action of a man who knows the legal ground is weak and needed the political solution before the legal one could be fully established. He held her gaze. He needed tonight. He will not keep needing it. The Castalian precedent doesn't disappear because of a vote. It sits in the legal record and it waits. "You're telling me to be patient." I'm telling you that what happened tonight is not the end of what started last night, he said. I need you to hold that. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light in the corridor was cold and flat, and it showed everything without flattery. His face, the tiredness under the control, the specific quality of a man who has been outmaneuvered by his own brother and is absorbing that at the same time as everything else. I'll hold it, she said, but I need something from you. Name it. Honesty, she said. Complete honesty. Not strategic disclosure, not information managed by timing. If something happens that I need to know about it when you know about it, not after you've decided how to handle it. He looked at her. Agreed. Including Darius. A beat. Something behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read. Including Darius, he said. She nodded once. She turned and walked toward the guard barracks corridor, and she did not let herself look back, because she had learned early that looking back at the things you're leaving costs you the energy you need for the direction you're walking. The guard barracks in the Citadel's East Wing were utilitarian in the way of spaces designed for people the institution considers interchangeable. Shared sleeping rooms for the lower ranks, small individual quarters for officers. Lyanna had an officer's room. She had earned it on the merit of her assessments and field work, not through any particular institutional warmth toward her. And she returned to it now and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and let the stillness of the space settle around her. Her room was small. She had made it smaller, over the years, with books stacked against the walls and maps pinned to the stone above the desk, and a rack of her training equipment along the far wall, things that took up space and made the room feel occupied. She had never thought of it as a strategy, the accumulation of objects, but sitting in it now she recognized it as one. Make the room feel claimed. Make it feel like you belong somewhere in the specific physical sense of having put things there. She looked at the maps on the wall. She looked at the eastern border map she had pinned 3 months ago, when the first reports of Morthian repositioning had come through the intelligence channels that nobody in the upper court had taken seriously. She had taken it seriously. She had flagged it in her assessments. The assessments had been filed and not escalated because she was a guard officer with no house and no wolf, and the people who made decisions about which assessments were taken to the upper command were people who had spent years learning to discount her. She stood and pulled the map off the wall. There is a specific quality to the moment when the things you have been dismissed for become the things everyone needs. It is not satisfying in the way that vindication stories suggest. It is not clean or sweet. What it is a kind of grief for the time lost, for all the months and years during which the right answer sat in a room where nobody was listening, and the cost of that silence accrued in ways that were now walking toward a border in 3 Morthian divisions. She had been right about Morthia for 6 months. She had been right about Darius for 2 years. She had been right, in the quiet internal accounting she had never shown to anyone, about most of the things the court had trained her to doubt herself on. Being right in isolation is one of the more expensive ways to be right. She spread the map on her desk and put her hands flat on it and looked at the pass. The knock came 20 minutes later. Not Vane's 3-beat, not Kalen's economy. This was softer, more hesitant, the knock of someone who wasn't sure of their reception. She already knew before she opened the door. Darius stood in the corridor in plain clothes, not guard dress, not formal, looking like a man who had not slept since before the ceremony last night, which was probably accurate. She opened the door and looked at him and did not move to let him in. I need to explain, he said. You don't, she said. I understand exactly what happened. Lyanna, you spent the night working the floor, she said. Her voice was entirely level. This was the thing she had discovered about being genuinely done. It removed the heat. Not the pain. The pain was structural and would take a long time, but the heat. What was left was a clarity that felt almost impersonal. You moved 3 votes. You had the relationships to do it, and you used them. The assembly voided the claim. His face worked. I was trying to... Don't tell me what you were trying to do, she said. Tell me the true version. You couldn't stand what last night looked like. You couldn't stand being the man who didn't choose me, standing next to the man who did. So you spent 12 hours making the contrast disappear. He was very still. That's it, she said. That's the whole of it. Not Seraphine, not Draven, you. It's more complicated. Darius, something in her voice stopped him. I spent 10 years making you more complicated than you were. I'm done with that. You are a man who had 10 years to do the thing that would have cost him something real, and every time the moment came, you found the version that cost less. Last night, when Kaylin claimed me, you finally ran out of versions. She looked at him. So you took it back. You spent a night working people you've known for 20 years to take back the thing you never had the courage to give me. Well, Baba Simachiwa. He looked like he had been struck. She recognized it. She had seen it in the training yard when someone landed a hit they didn't expect, the genuine blink of impact before the body adjusts. I'm sorry, he said. I know you are, she said. I believe you. It doesn't change the shape of what you did. You didn't think about me, she said. You thought about how you looked. That's not new, Darius. I just couldn't see it when I was inside it. A long silence in the corridor. Somewhere below them, the Citadel's morning routines moved forward without care for any of this. What do you want from me? He said. Tell me, and I'll do it. I don't want anything from you, she said. And this was the most painful true thing she had said in a long time. Not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. And the accuracy of having no wants left for someone you spent 10 years oriented toward is its own specific desolation. I'm going to go back to being a guard officer and doing my work, and you are going to do whatever comes next for you, and we are going to stop pretending that this is something it was never going to be. She started to close the door. There's something you should know, he said quickly. About Draven. She stopped. He met with someone this morning, Darius said. Before the assembly. I was in the East Residential Corridor and I saw the meeting through the junction. I didn't hear everything, but the man he met with was Morthian. Not an ambassador, not official. A private meeting. She felt the information reorganize everything around it instantly. The Morthian divisions repositioning. The assembly vote timed to destabilize. A private meeting the morning of the vote. Who was the man? She said. I don't know his name, Darius said. He wore a field officer's mark. Not Morthian military dress, civilian clothes, but the field mark was on his belt. The kind of mark the Morthian Second Army uses. The Second Army. Seraphine's uncle commanded the Morthian Second Army. This was not about succession anymore. This had not been about succession for some time. She pulled the door fully open. Come in. He stepped inside. She went to the desk and the map. Show me where, she said. What? The junction where you saw the meeting. Show me on the Citadel layout. She was already pulling the secondary map from the wall, the Citadel floor plan she kept for posting rotation work. She spread it over the border map. Show me the exact location. He crossed the room and looked at the map. He pointed to a junction in the East Residential Corridor, which was, she traced the path, directly adjacent to the room the Imperial Senate used for its private deliberation sessions. A room that would have been occupied this morning by the Senate members arriving early for the assembly. Someone had conducted a private meeting with a Morthian military officer within 50 feet of the pre-assembly Senate deliberation room, not to influence the vote. The vote was already being worked through Darius's house relationships. The meeting was for something else. When exactly? She said. What bell? Second bell, he said. Maybe just after. Second bell. The assembly had convened at the fourth, the vote had closed at the fifth. The Eastern Border Dispatch she had reviewed with Kaylin had been from last night's reports. It would not include anything that had moved today. Get out, she said. He blinked. Lyanna, not you, she said. She was already moving to the door. Go back to your quarters and stay there. Don't talk to anyone about what you just told me. What's happening? I don't know yet, she said. That's why you need to stay out of it. She looked at him once, fully, the last uncomplicated look she would give him for a long time. Go. He went. She moved. She found Vane outside the intelligence office on the third corridor, which meant he had anticipated her trajectory, which meant Kaylin had told him to watch for her, which meant the information flow was already working the way she had asked for. She told Vane everything Darius had said in under 90 seconds. Vane listened without interrupting and then said, The Second Army. The field mark on the belt, he was sure. Vane turned and opened the intelligence office door and went in. She followed. He went to the cipher dispatch rack and pulled 2 documents, both from this morning, both in the eastern border cipher she recognized. He handed them to her. She read the first one, and then the second one. The Morthian divisions had not simply repositioned toward the pass. According to this morning's reports, they had advanced. They were 2 days from the northern approach. Not a repositioning, a march. They moved at dawn, Vane said. The orders were issued last night after the ceremony. The ceremony, the claim, the political destabilization Draven had timed precisely. She saw it completely now. It was not complicated. It was, in fact, devastatingly simple in the way that genuinely dangerous plans always are. Draven had created the political crisis to occupy the Empire's attention and its legal apparatus. The Morthian army was using the window of that occupation to advance on a border that would be 3 divisions undermanned if the Eastern Command had stood down any units in anticipation of the Senate calling for an internal review, which was standard protocol when a succession crisis was declared. The Empire's eastern border had partially stood down. The Morthian army was 2 days from the pass, and the private meeting this morning had been the final coordination. The vote confirmation passed to the Morthian officer, so the army knew the political cover would hold for at least another 48 hours. "Kaelin," she said. "He's with the Emperor," Vane said. "I was about to go in." "Go now," she said. "I'm coming with you." Vane looked at her. He looked at the dispatches in her hands. He made the calculation that she had made and arrived at the same place. "Yes," he said. They moved. The corridor to the Emperor's private council chamber was guarded by 4 men, and all 4 of them stepped aside for Vane on sight, and one of them looked at Lyanna for a half-second before stepping aside for her too. Not because she had standing, not because the assembly had ratified anything, but because she was walking next to Vane with the dispatch papers in her hands at a pace that communicated that the next 60 seconds would determine the shape of something large. The council chamber door opened. Kaelin looked up from the table where he sat across from his father. Both men read the room in one beat. Lyanna put the dispatches on the table. She put her finger on the pass on the eastern border map that was already spread there, because of course it was. "They're not repositioning," she said. "They're advancing, 2 days out." The political crisis was the distraction, and while the assembly voted this morning, someone used the window to give the Morthian Second Army the confirmation they needed to move. The room was absolutely still. Then Kaelin said, "Draven." "The meeting Darius witnessed," she said. "A Morthian field officer with a Second Army mark. East Residential Corridor, second bell." The Emperor looked at his son. His son looked at the map. Then Emperor Kaelin Valor looked at Lyanna Vale, the wolfless orphan guard officer with no house and no claim and no formal standing in this room. And he looked at her the way he had looked at his own generals across 60 years of councils, with the flat full attention of a man assessing a source. "What do you recommend?" he said. "Do." She had not been asked that question in her life. Not like this. Not by this person in this room with these stakes. She looked at the map. She had been right about Morthia for 6 months. She had been right alone in a room where no one was listening. Now the room was listening, and the army was 2 days from the pass, and every piece of analysis she had built in isolation was suddenly the most important thing anyone in this chamber possessed. This was the moment. Not the ceremony, not the compact, not the assembly vote. This was the moment where Lyanna Vale stopped existing in the margins and stepped to the center. Not because someone claimed her or because a legal citation gave her standing, but because she was the only person in the room who had spent 6 months watching this specific threat develop. And she knew, with the precision of someone who had been tracking it without resources or recognition, exactly what the next 48 hours needed to look like. And the Empire, finally, was out of time to pretend she didn't exist. She opened her mouth. And from the corridor outside the council chamber, muffled but unmistakable, the sound of the Citadel's emergency alarm. 3 short strikes. A pause. 3 more. Border breach. Not 2 days. Now. The alarm did not stop. 3 strikes. Pause. 3 more. The border breach signal. And it ran continuously, which meant whoever had triggered it had not rescinded the order, which meant the breach was confirmed and holding. In Lyanna's 2 years on Eastern posting, she had heard that alarm 4 times. 3 of those times, it had been drills. The 4th had been a probe incursion at the southern edge of the pass, 12 Morthian scouts dealt with in under an hour. This was not that. Kaelin was already moving before the second cycle of the alarm finished. He crossed to the door and pulled it open, and the guard captain outside said, without waiting to be asked, "Rider from the eastern forward post, Morthian infantry breached the pass approach 40 minutes ago. Estimate 3,000 at the front line with 2 divisions behind." 3,000 at the front, 2 divisions behind. That was not a probe, that was an opening. "My horse," Kalen said. "Full command kit, 5 minutes." The captain moved. Kalen turned back into the room. The Emperor had not moved from his chair, which told Lyanna that the old man had already run the calculation and arrived somewhere she hadn't yet. He was watching his son with the specific quality of a man who has sent people he loves into situations they might not return from before, and has learned, across a long life of exactly that, to hold his face still while doing it. "The Eastern Garrison strength," Kalen said to Vane. After the stand down for the Senate review protocol, 4,000 effective, Vane said. Another 600 at the secondary post, 20 minutes back. Against 3 divisions. If they're fully committed, yes. Lyanna was already at the map. She had it open in her head. She had been working this map for 6 months, and the geography was as familiar as her own hands. "The pass approach has a natural choke at the Thornwall Ridge," she said. "Here." She put her finger on it without looking up. "If the forward garrison can hold at the ridge rather than the approach, the Morthian numbers don't deploy fully. They can't spread formation in the canyon. You're fighting a narrowed front." Kalen was beside her in 2 steps. He looked at the map. He looked at the ridge. "The forward post is south of the ridge," he said. "I know. They need to pull back and reestablish at the ridge line before the Morthian front closes on them. If they hold at the approach, they're fighting open ground against 3-to-1 numbers, and the 2 rear divisions funnel in behind." She looked up at him. "They have maybe 40 minutes before the front line reaches the approach. If someone tells them to pull back to the ridge now, they have time." He looked at the map for exactly 3 seconds. The quality of those 3 seconds was the quality of someone who has made thousands of tactical decisions and learned that the ones you spend too long on are rarely the ones that needed more time. "Send the rider," he said to Vane. "Garrison pulls back to the Thornwall Ridge. Hold position. I want the secondary post moving to reinforce in 20 minutes. Vane was gone before the sentence fully closed. Kalen looked at Lyanna. "You're coming," he said. Not a question. "You need the analysis in the field," she said. "Not in a room. I've been building this picture for 6 months." "I know." He had already turned toward the door. "Stay close." She looked at the Emperor one final time. The old man met her eyes with the flat, full attention he had shown her when he asked for her recommendation. He said nothing. But the look said something she didn't have time to fully translate. Something between acknowledgement and the particular gravity of a man who has just watched a thing he has been watching for a long time finally arrive. She moved. The Citadel's lower yard was organized chaos in the specific productive way of a military installation that is trained for this exact sequence. Horses already saddled and being led out. Command staff pulling on field gear. Riders dispatching in 3 directions simultaneously, each carrying orders she could track by the routes they took. Eastern Garrison, Secondary Post, the border house commanders who would need to be activated. Kalen mounted with the economy of someone who had done it under worse conditions than a yard in daylight. He was in field blacks now, armor over the uniform, the commander's mark on the chest piece rather than the ceremonial chain. He looked different in field gear. Not harder, more accurate. Like the ceremonial version was the performance, and this was the actual thing underneath it. She had been given a horse by a groom she didn't recognize, which meant Vane had communicated her presence in the deployment, which meant Kalen had included her in the command structure without announcing it, which was the most functional and quietly significant thing he had done since the ceremony 2 nights ago. She mounted. She checked the field kit on the saddle, maps, the cipher key she would need for communication with the forward post, a short blade she hadn't asked for but found there and was grateful for. Kalen looked at her once across the yard. She gave him a single nod. They moved out at the gallop. The road to the eastern border was 4 hours in good conditions. They pushed for 3, changing pace between gallop and hard trot, the command unit of 12 riders moving with the compressed speed of people who understand that time is already the enemy. The morning sky was cold and clear, the kind of clarity that made everything visible at distance, which was good for observation and equally good for being observed. Lyanna rode second in the column, behind Kalen's lead rider and ahead of the command staff. She spent the ride recalibrating what she knew against what had changed in the past 12 hours. The Morthian advance had been ordered last night after the ceremony, which meant the ceremony itself had been the trigger point, which meant Draven had communicated the outcome of the Hall of Moons to the Morthian command within hours of it happening, which required a communication chain that had been in place long before last night. This was not improvised. This was the conclusion of a plan that had been running for months, possibly longer, using the succession crisis as its operational cover. What she had flagged 6 months ago in her assessments was not the beginning of the threat. It was the middle of it. The beginning had been Draven's marriage alliance with the Morthian commander's family. The beginning had been the deliberate cultivation of Seraphine's position. The beginning had been the slow, careful preparation of a political crisis timed to open a military window. Someone had spent years building this, and for 6 months she had been sitting in a guard posting with her analysis filed in a cabinet that nobody opened, watching the pieces accumulate, understanding what they added up to, and having no standing from which to make anyone listen. She thought about this across 3 hours of hard writing, and she let herself feel, fully and without mitigation, the specific anger of it. Not at any single person. At the architecture, the system that had decided her judgment was not worth the institutional cost of acting on it, because she was the wrong kind of person to have the right kind of information. She had spent so long inside that system that she had almost accepted its terms, had almost agreed, in some deep and unspoken part of herself, that maybe her assessments were worth less because she was worth less, that the court's measure of her had some legitimate basis. It didn't. It never had. It was wrong in the specific flat way that institutions are wrong when they mistake the container for the contents. She was done accepting its terms. They heard the Eastern engagement before they saw it. The sound of large-scale combat at distance has a specific texture, not the individual sounds of swords and voices, but a collective low rumble that carries differently from any other sound that you feel in the chest before you identify it with the ears. It was coming from the northeast, which meant the forward garrison had not made the ridge in time, or had made the ridge and was holding under pressure. And either way, the engagement was active. Kalen slowed the column to a hard trot and turned to his senior field commander, a compact woman named Orin, who had been running the Eastern Command structure for 7 years. "Status," he said. "Ryder came back 10 minutes ago," Orin said, pulling alongside. "Garrison pulled back to the ridge. They're holding. Morthian front is pressing the south face, but the choke is working. They can't deploy full formation in the canyon, and they know it. But the 2nd Division is moving to flank around the western approach." "How long to the western approach?" "For a full division at march pace, 3 hours. Maybe 2.5 if they push." Lyanna said, "They won't march. They'll run them." Orin looked at her. "They know the window is limited," Lyanna said. "Once the secondary post reinforces at the ridge, the choke becomes harder to break. They'll push the flanking division at double pace to close the window." She looked at Kalen. "We have 90 minutes before the western approach is contested. Maybe less." Kalen looked at Orin. "She's right," Orin said with the flat pragmatism of someone who doesn't waste time on the source of good information when good information is what she needs. "If the flank closes, we're fighting a 2-front hold with a reinforced ridge garrison, and we're still 3-1 on numbers." "What do we have for the western approach?" Kalen said. "The Border House Cavalry," Orin said. "If they've mobilized. I sent the activation order 40 minutes ago." "How many riders?" "House Aldrin and House Castle combined, maybe 800. Against a Morthian division that's been moving all morning. 800 cavalry holding a canyon approach against a running division," Lyanna said. "They can't hold it. But they can slow it." She thought through the geography. The western approach had a different profile from the pass, wider, more open, which worked against a small defensive force, but also meant cavalry had room to maneuver. They don't need to hold. They need to make the Morthian division stop running and form up. Formation takes time. It burns their window. Kalen was quiet for the count of 2 breaths. "Orin," he said, "take the cavalry activation and have them intercept at the western approach. Harassment pattern, not engagement. Make them slow down. Make them think there's more than 800. "Yes, sir." "And I need the Draven household riders identified in the field. Anyone flying Draven colors on an eastern approach gets detained. Anyone attempting to relay out of the eastern zone gets detained." Orin looked at him. She registered what that meant and moved on from it without comment, The professionalism of someone who has understood that the domestic politics have become part of the operational picture. She broke off with 3 riders. Kaelin and Lyanna rode forward. The Thornwall Ridge was exactly what its name suggested, a lateral spine of dark granite running east to west across the pass approach, steep enough on the south face to make assault expensive, and wide enough along the top that a defensive line could hold formation. The forward garrison had positioned well. She could see the line from the approach road, a disciplined row of spears and shield against the gray stone. 4,000 people who had received an order to pull back and had done it correctly, and were now doing the harder thing, which was holding. The sound was much louder here. The Morthian front was pressing the south face in rotating waves, not full assault. She recognized the pattern. Sustained pressure designed to tire the garrison down before the main push. Standard attrition tactics. They were buying time for the flank to close. Kaelin pulled up at the command post at the base of the ridge, a rough field structure that Oren's forward staff had established. A map table, a communication line to the ridge garrison, a rider relay. He dismounted and went to the table, and she was beside him in the same motion. The garrison commander came down from the ridge in 3 minutes. A broad-shouldered man named Crest, who looked like he had been awake for 36 hours and was running on something simpler and more durable than sleep. "They've sent 4 waves," Crest said. "We've held each one. The choke is working, but if they figure out a way to push volume into the approach at once rather than rotating, they won't figure it out," Lyanna said. "The rotation is intentional. They're not trying to break the ridge. They're trying to exhaust you before the flank arrives." Crest looked at her. Kaelin said, "She's been tracking this operation for 6 months. Listen to her." The garrison commander listened. "The flank is the real push," she said. "When it arrives at the western approach, they'll coordinate. Simultaneous pressure on the ridge and a fresh division hitting the western side. Your garrison will split attention. That's when the ridge breaks." She looked at the map. "We need the secondary post to not reinforce the ridge directly. We need them at the western approach with the cavalry. That leaves the ridge at 4,000 against a sustained press. The ridge holds," she said. "The choke holds. You've proven that through 4 waves. You can sustain it. What you cannot sustain is a 2-front break with a fresh division." She met his eyes. "The ridge holds because it has to. The western approach is where the outcome gets decided." Crest looked at Kaelin. Kaelin said, "Do it." There is something that happens to a person in the middle of a genuine crisis. Not the performed urgency of institutional emergency, but real crisis. The kind where the wrong decision in the next 60 seconds produces consequences that cannot be walked back. What happens is a kind of brutal simplification. Everything that is not directly relevant to the next 60 seconds ceases to exist. The assembly vote and the voided claim and the 10 years of the court's careful architecture of her irrelevance, none of it had weight right now. What had weight was the map and the ridge and the sound coming off the south face and the specific calculation of whether 800 cavalry could slow a running Morthian division long enough to matter. Lyanna had spent her whole life being simplification ready. She had spent her whole life operating in environments where the resources were minimal and the margin for error was 0. And you made it work anyway, because the alternative was not making it work. And not making it work had consequences she had never been willing to accept. This was bigger than anything she had operated in before. The scale was different. The stakes were different. But the fundamental condition, make it work with what you have, was the same condition she had always been in. She found, in the middle of the command post with the ridge noise overhead and the map spread below, that she was not afraid. She was focused in a way that felt clean and total, the way a blade is clean when it has been correctly made. Not absence of something, but completeness, everything exactly where it needed to be. She was exactly where she needed to be. The western approach engagement began before the cavalry was fully in position. The Morthian flanking division had pushed faster than double pace. They had pushed at a run, which told Lyanna they had better intelligence about the cavalry activation than the activation order's transmission time should have allowed. Draven. He had communication lines into the field. Someone in the eastern zone was relaying for him. She grabbed a rider. "Find Commander Oren. Tell her the intelligence leak is active in the eastern zone. Communication relay for Draven. She needs to pull the Draven household riders now. Not detain. Pull. Pull them out of any position where they can observe or transmit." She looked at the rider. Now. Those words exactly. The rider went. She turned back to the command table. Kaelin was running the Ridge communication, coordinating the garrison response to the 5th Morthian wave, which was heavier than the previous 4. Not rotation anymore, the Morthian front commander was changing the pattern, which meant he knew the flank was close and was beginning to press for the simultaneous break. Kaelin, she said. He looked up. The 5th wave is the signal. They know the flank is engaged. They're going for the coordinated break. His jaw set. Ridge garrison depth? 2nd rank is fresh, Crest said from beside him. We can rotate up. Do it, Kaelin said. 1st rank pulls back to rest position. 2nd rank forward. He looked at Lyanna. How long does the cavalry need? To slow a running division enough to matter. 20 minutes, maybe 25. The Ridge can give them 20, Crest said, if the 2nd rank holds through the push. The 2nd rank holds, Kaelin said. Tell them it holds. Crest turned and went back up the ridge at a run, and then from the western approach, the sound changed. The cavalry had engaged. She could hear it in the difference between the sustained push at the ridge and the sharper, more intermittent sound from the west, the specific chaos of a harassment engagement where a smaller force was moving fast to avoid being fixed in place. That was exactly right. Move, strike, pull back, force the division to slow and reform. Every minute the division spent reforming was a minute the secondary post was closing the distance. Kaelin came and stood beside her at the map. They need a commander at the western approach, she said. The cavalry is executing the harassment, but someone needs to coordinate the transition when the secondary post arrives. Make it look like a larger force than it is. Buy the extra 10 minutes. I'm going, he said. Kaelin, I'm the senior field commander, he said, and it needs to look like a significant command presence to hold the Morthian division's attention. A king on the field reads differently than a cavalry captain. She looked at him. This was accurate. She hated that it was accurate. Orin takes the ridge coordination, he said. You stay at the command post and run the intelligence picture. If the leak is still active, I need someone here who can identify the pattern. You need someone at the western approach who knows the Morthian Second Army's operational patterns, she said. I need someone I trust at this table, he said, and the word trust in that sentence had a specific weight she felt in her chest. That's you. She held his gaze for one breath, then, the secondary post commander is a man named Fenwick. He's cautious. He'll want to form up properly before he engages. Don't let him. Tell him the cavalry is doing the work and he needs to close fast and make noise. Volume and speed, not formation. Fenwick, Kaelin said. Noise over formation. Yes. He looked at her, the way he had looked at her across the table in his antechamber this morning. The full specific quality of it. Nothing managed or performed. Stay alive, he said. You too, she said. He mounted and moved out with 4 riders at the gallop, and she watched him go for exactly the 3 seconds she could afford and then turned back to the table. The next 40 minutes were the most concentrated work she had ever done. The ridge held through the 6th wave barely. She could hear the close quality of it in the communication from the garrison, the specific tightness in the relay rider's voice when he came down with the status report. 2nd rank pressed hard, casualties in the double digits. The Morthian front was not rotating anymore. It was pushing with full commitment, which meant the front commander had committed to the coordinated break and was running it regardless of whether the flank was ready, which meant something had changed on the flank. She grabbed the next relay rider coming in from the western direction. Report! Cavalry is holding the harassment, the rider said, breathing hard. But the Morthian division has started to split. Half is pressing the cavalry engagement, the other half is trying to go around to the north. Around to the north. If a half division got north of the western approach, it could come around behind the ridge garrison and break the position from the rear. She had 60 seconds to think and no margin for being wrong. She pulled the Citadel map from the secondary stack. The full regional geography, not just the pass approach. The northern route around the western approach would take a Morthian half division through the Selwyn ground, which was soft earth, marshland in the spring season, and it was spring. A full infantry formation moving fast through Selwyn ground would... She grabbed a rider. Find Commander Orin. Tell her to release a single unit from the ridge, 2nd rank. 100 men. I need them running north to the Selwyn ground immediately. They are not fighting. They are making noise and tracks. I need the Morthian commander to think there is a blocking force in the marsh. Go. Rider gone. She looked at the map. She looked at the ridge communication line. She looked at the western approach relay. Then something she had not been tracking broke through the perimeter. Not from the Morthian positions, from the rear, from the Citadel direction. 3 Draven household riders, moving fast through the command post perimeter at the south end, and they were not detained because Oren's order had not reached the rear perimeter yet, and they were carrying something in the lead rider's pack that she identified from the size and shape of it as a communication tube, the kind used for sealed dispatch relay. She did not think. She moved. She had cleared the table and was in the path of the lead rider before the perimeter guards had fully registered the situation. The horse shied at her sudden appearance in its path, and the rider pulled up hard. "Off the horse," she said. The rider looked at her. He was 25, wearing Draven red, and he made the mistake of calculating whether she was a real obstacle. "Off the horse," she said again, and her voice had the specific quality she had developed across 10 years of being the first person in a training yard and the last one out. The quality of someone who does not repeat herself for any reason other than making sure the words were heard the first time. He reached for the pack. She took him off the horse. It was not elegant. It was functional. She used the horse's own shying motion, the momentum of the animal's step away, and she was on the rider's left side pulling the arm before he could close on the pack. He hit the ground. She had the pack in the time it took him to start getting up. 2 perimeter guards arrived. "Detain him," she said, "and the other 2. She opened the pack, the communication tube. She broke the Draven seal, she would account for that later, and extracted the message inside. It was in cipher. Not the Eastern Command cipher she knew. A different one. She looked at it for 3 seconds. It was a 2-part substitution. She could see the structure in the groupings, and she did not have the key, but she had been reading the Eastern Command cipher for 2 years, and the structural logic was similar enough that she could see the shape of what was being communicated, even if she couldn't read the specific words. She could read 2 things clearly: a number that appeared 3 times in the message, and a direction marker that corresponded to the compass notation she knew from Eastern Command dispatches. The number was 700. The direction was north-northeast, 700, coming from the north-northeast. That was not the flanking division. That was a 3rd force, a force that had been moving separately, that had not appeared in the morning dispatches because it had not been on the approaches they were watching. 700 was not a division. 700 was a strike unit, mobile, fast, built for a specific target rather than a broad engagement. A strike unit coming from the north-northeast would arrive at the Citadel itself, not the pass, not the ridge. The Citadel. While every command asset the Empire had was deployed to the eastern border, 700 Morthian strike soldiers were moving on the seat of the Empire from a direction nobody was watching. She was running before she fully completed the thought. The rider she put on the fastest horse in the command post's relay line had her message in his hand, and 30 seconds of instruction burned into his head. Commander Vane, the Citadel, the north-northeast approach, 720 minutes ahead, she estimated. The rider went. She sent a second rider to Kaelin at the western approach with the same message. Then she stood at the command table with the decoded approximation of the Draven dispatch in her hand, and she understood, fully and completely, what the shape of tonight had always been. The pass was the distraction. The assembly vote was the distraction. Even the flanking maneuver was a distraction. Every piece of the Morthian operation that had drawn the Empire's command structure to the eastern border had been designed to empty the Citadel of its defensive capacity and leave the Emperor of Varanth protected by a standard residential guard rotation, while a 700-person strike unit closed the last miles from the north. They were not trying to breach the border. They were trying to take the throne. And in the Citadel right now were the Emperor, the Chancellor, the Senate members who had voted this morning, and Darius. She looked at the relay line. She looked at the road north. She looked at the map. The fastest route from the command post to a position that intercepted the north-northeast approach was not back to the Citadel. That was too slow. The interception point was the Grafen Junction, 7 miles north, where the north-northeast approach crossed the main road, and where, if something was in position, the strike unit would have to engage it rather than pass it. There was nothing in position at the Grafen Junction. There was no time to send a force from the command post. There was no force to send. Every available unit was committed to the ridge or the western approach, except the secondary post riders that Oren had never redirected. because the order had gone to the western approach with Kaelin and had not been relayed back. And the secondary post was, she checked the map, 12 minutes from the Grafen Junction if they were already moving. She grabbed the last available relay rider. She gave him the order and the route and the specific words for the secondary post commander. Not Fenwick's cautious formation, but a running intercept. Every rider at full speed, the junction in 12 minutes, hold the junction. The rider went. She stood alone at the command table. Then she took the remaining horse, the one she had ridden from the Citadel, still tacked, tied to the post, and she mounted, and she thought about everything she had just set in motion and everything she could not control from a command post 7 miles from the place where it would be decided. She thought about the Emperor in his chair and Vane in his office, and Darius in his quarters, and the standard residential guard rotation that was standing between them and 700 soldiers who had been running since before dawn. She thought about Kaelin at the western approach, receiving her message, making the same calculation she had just made. She thought about a month from now, or a year, or 10 years, and what the shape of that time would be determined by what happened in the next 40 minutes. She thought, I have spent my whole life in the margins. I have spent my whole life being the person nobody planned for, the contingency nobody made, the name nobody wrote into their documents because I did not have the right blood or the right bond or the right wolf. And then Kaelin Valor had written my name into his contingency 3 days before any of this began, and the Empire had voted to erase it, and the border had opened, and the real threat had come from the north where nobody was watching, and I was the only person in this command post who had read it in time. She turned the horse north. She was going to the Grafen Junction, not because she had been ordered to, not because she had standing or claim or any formal place in the command structure that authorized this, because she was the person who had the most complete picture of what was moving toward the Citadel and what would be required to stop it, and because sitting at a command post waiting for other people to execute decisions based on her information was not, and had never been, the thing she was built for. The road opened in front of her. She pushed the horse to a flat gallop. Behind her, the ridge held its line. The western approach burned with the noise of cavalry and a cautious commander being told to move fast for once in his career. The Selwyn Marsh was full of 100 running men making enough noise for a blocking force that didn't exist. And somewhere ahead of her, 700 Morthian soldiers were closing the last miles toward a throne they had been promised. She was the only thing between them and the road that led there. She had been the only thing standing between outcomes and disaster her entire life. She had been doing it without recognition, without resources, without anyone who had planned for her to be there. The difference was that this time, someone had. And when this was over, when the junction held or didn't hold, when the ridge stood or fell, when the Empire looked at the wreckage of this night and tried to understand what had saved it, she intended to still be standing. Not in the margins, not in the left wing of any hall in gray guard dress with no house crest and no name on anyone's formal document. She intended to be standing at the center of it, where she had always belonged, where Kaelin Valor had seen her belonging before she had fully allowed herself to see it. The Grafen Junction appeared at the top of the rise. The secondary post riders were not there yet, and from the north-northeast, just becoming visible as a dark mass against the pale morning hillside, 700 soldiers were running, and they were running fast, and they had not yet seen her. She pulled the horse to a stop at the junction. She had no unit, no backup, nothing but the horse beneath her and the blade on the saddle and the full weight of everything she had figured out in the past 12 hours. She heard, from behind her, the sound of hooves. She turned. Not the secondary post. Kaelin. He had ridden from the western approach alone, leaving the field command to Orin, running the same calculation she had run, arriving at the same place. He pulled up beside her. He took in the junction. He took in the mass of soldiers on the hillside. He looked at her. The secondary post is 8 minutes out, she said. I know, he said. 700 against 2 isn't... I know, he said again. The dark mass on the hillside had seen them. The front of the formation was slowing, which meant their commanders were assessing. 2 riders at the junction, the choke point of the only road to the Citadel. Not a force, not a unit, just 2 people and a stretch of road. The Morthian commander would know they were not a blocking force. He would know. But he would not know why 2 people had ridden out to a junction ahead of his 700. And in that uncertainty, he would do what cautious military commanders do. He would slow. He would look for the thing he wasn't seeing. He would spend 4 or 5 minutes reforming into a salt pattern rather than running through an unknown. 4 or 5 minutes. The secondary post needed 8. She looked at Kaylin. "We need to look like more than we are," she said. "Yes. So we move," she said, "constantly. Along the ridgeline, fast, appear and disappear. Make him think we're the front edge of something behind us." "For 4 minutes," he said. "For 4 minutes," she said. He looked at the hillside, at the formation slowing, at the junction and the road behind them and everything that was still alive in the empire that sat at the end of that road. He said, "When this is over." "When this is over," she said. "Not now." Something in his face that she would think about for a long time afterward. "Now we move," she said. She pushed the horse east along the ridgeline, fast and visible, and he went west, and between them they made the shape of a force that wasn't there. And the Morthian commander looked at the junction and looked at the riders and looked at the ridge, and could not find the thing he wasn't seeing, and he slowed and reformed, and in the 4 minutes that cost him, the secondary post riders arrived over the southern rise with the full noise and volume of a force twice their number. And the junction held, and from the eastern ridge, the 7th Morthian wave broke against 4,000 people who had decided, somewhere in the grinding hours of that morning, that they were not going to be the garrison that let the empire fall. And in the Citadel, Vane had received the message and the residential guard had been tripled, and Darius Vaelor, who had spent a sleepless night moving votes, and a morning sitting with the consequences of exactly what that had meant, had taken a sword off a wall rack and walked to the Emperor's door and stood outside it, not because anyone had ordered him to, but because he was finally, in the smallest and most private way, trying to be a different kind of man than the one who had existed before last night. All of this was happening. And at the Grafen Junction, with the secondary post engaged and the Morthian strike unit breaking against unexpected resistance, Kaelin Vaelor pulled his horse alongside Lyanna Vale and looked at her in the full cold light of morning, both of them breathing hard, both of them still there, and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that the fact of them both still being there did not already say more completely. She looked back at him. And from the north, from a direction she had not been watching, from a source she had not yet identified, in a frequency she had no prior experience with, something moved in her that was not thought, and was not decision, and was not any of the careful, rational architecture she had built across 31 years of surviving in places that had not been designed for her. Something ancient, something that had been sleeping for her entire life. Something that cracked open like bedrock under pressure and sent a fissure running through every wall she had ever built, not destroying them. She would rebuild them, she always did, but marking them permanently. Marking them as the walls of someone who had been changed by something she had no category for. She felt it in her spine first, then in her hands, then everywhere. Her wolf, which had never come, which the court had built its entire assessment of her worthlessness upon, which she had spent 31 years being told the absence of proved something fundamental about her value, was not absent. It had never been absent. It had been waiting, and it had chosen this moment, this junction, this morning, this man beside her. It had chosen the precise intersection of everything she was, and everything she had survived, and everything she was no longer willing to be dismissed for, to wake up. The light changed. She felt it in her body before she saw it with her eyes. Kaelin went completely still beside her. She looked at her hands. They were not her hands anymore. Or they were exactly her hands. They were more her hands than they had ever been. But they were something else at the same time, something older and larger, and lit from inside with a light that was the color of nothing she had seen in the waking world before. Shadow. And silver. And the specific light that exists at the edge of things that have not yet been fully named. The Shadow Sovereign bloodline. The bloodline the first emperors had come from. The bloodline every noble house in the empire had spent centuries claiming dead, claiming extinct, claiming lost in the long dark of history, because if it existed, it changed every calculation about who had the right to what. It was not extinct. It had been standing in the left wing of the Hall of Moons in a gray guard uniform with no house crest and split knuckles and 10 years of being called worthless, and it had been waiting, in the patient particular way of things that are not diminished by being unrecognized, for the moment when the person carrying it was finally ready to stop surviving and start becoming. The Morthian formation on the hillside had gone still. Every soldier looking at the junction, at the light, at the woman at the center of it. Kalen said quietly, with the specific quality of a man who has just confirmed something he had believed before he had proof of it, "There she is." And the Empire, which had spent 31 years deciding what Lyanna Vale was worth, was about to find out how badly it had miscalculated. The light did not last long. That was the first thing she would remember clearly afterward. Not its intensity, which was considerable, not the way the Morthian formation had stopped moving as though the ground beneath their boots had simply ceased to be reliable, but the brevity of it. 30 seconds, perhaps 40, the silver shadow light pouring from her hands and up her arms and into the cold morning air, and then it pulled back into her body like water receding. And she was sitting on her horse at the Grafen Junction in the early light, feeling simultaneously like she had been turned inside out and like she had, for the first time in her life, been turned exactly right side in. The Morthian formation on the hillside had not broken. Trained soldiers do not break from light, but they had stopped, and in the stopping the secondary post had closed the distance, and when the strike unit's commander looked at the junction and then at the riders coming up behind it, and then made the calculation of what his 700 could accomplish against a position that was no longer empty and a phenomenon he had no operational category for, he made the decision that has ended most military engagements in the history of every empire. He chose to survive it. The retreat was not a rout. It was organized, and it was fast, and it went north, back the way they had come. And the secondary post did not pursue because Lyanna told the post commander not to pursue, and his orders for this engagement were coming from her, and she knew that a retreating force you chase becomes a desperate force, and a desperate force turns and fights in ways that cost you more than letting them go. She let them go. She sat at the junction and watched them recede and breathed. Beside her, Kalen said nothing for a long time. When she looked at him, he was watching the hillside with the expression of a man filing several things simultaneously. The tactical situation, the information that had just been demonstrated at the junction, and something more personal that he was holding with the care of something that could break if handled wrong. "The ridge," she said. "Orin will hold it," he said. "The Morthian front started pulling back 20 minutes ago. The western flank is disengaging." He paused. "Without the strike unit taking the Citadel, the entire operation loses its purpose. They can't hold the pass against a full Imperial response without the political cover of a hostage situation at the throne. So it's over," she said. "The military engagement is over," he said. The rest is just beginning." She understood what he meant. The rest was Draven. The rest was the Senate and the Assembly and the formal accounting for a duke who had coordinated a foreign military incursion against the Empire he swore to serve. The rest was the legal and political work of dismantling something that had been built over years with patience and resources, and the particular arrogance of a man who had believed himself too well positioned to be caught. She looked at her hands. They looked like her hands. They had always looked like her hands. "You knew," she said. He looked at her. "Not what it was specifically," she said, "but you suspected something. That's why you watched me. That's part of what you were watching for." He was quiet for a moment. The honesty he had agreed to was working. "I suspected dormant lineage," he said. "The Shadow Sovereign bloodline produces certain behavioral signatures even in suppression. The refusal to diminish, the specific quality of endurance, a pattern of being underestimated that is almost too consistent to be accidental, too consistent to be explained only by circumstance." He held her gaze. "I did not know. I suspected. And I decided that what I suspected did not change what I intended. I was not claiming a bloodline. I was claiming you." She sat with that. There's a specific labor that belongs to people who have been defined by their absences, who have been told for so long that the thing they lack is the thing that determines their worth, that they begin, in the quiet places of themselves, to believe it. The labor of undoing that belief is not dramatic. It does not happen in a single moment of revelation. It happens in accumulation, in the slow revision of a self-concept that was never accurate but was repeated often enough to calcify. Lyanna Vale had spent 31 years in that labor, and what the Grafen Junction had given her was not a resolution to it, but an irrefutable piece of evidence that the premise had always been wrong. She was not wolfless. She was not broken. She was not the category error the court had decided she was. She was something the court had not had the architecture to process, and the court's failure to process her had never been her failure. It had always been theirs. She had known this in her mind for years. Now she knew it in her body, and those are different kinds of knowing, and the second one was going to take some time to fully inhabit. "Come on," she said. They rode back toward the ridge. The aftermath of a military engagement has its own specific rhythm, and it is nothing like the engagement itself. Combat has adrenaline and decision and the complete compression of everything into the next 60 seconds. Aftermath has mud and counting and the particular exhaustion of people who have been running on something that is now running out. The ridge garrison came down from the thorn wall in stages, and the secondary post integrated with the cavalry that had held the western approach. And everywhere she looked were people doing the unglamorous necessary work of surviving something they had not been certain they would survive. Casualties from the ridge engagement were in the hundreds, not thousands. The choke had worked. The garrison had held because they had held the right ground and because someone had told them to pull back before the math became impossible. And the fact that the someone was a guard officer with no formal standing in the command structure was the kind of thing that would be sorted out in the accounting later. She walked among the garrison at the base of the ridge, and she did not have the language for what it felt like to be looked at by people who had held a line and knew, in the specific way of people who had been in the middle of it, that the analysis that told them where to hold it had come from her. It was not gratitude exactly. It was recognition, the clean, direct recognition of people who do not have time for anything except the accurate assessment of what kept them alive. She had spent 10 years wanting nothing more than that from the court and receiving instead its performed and conditional version. This was the real thing, and it was quieter and more complete, and she held it without knowing how to express that she was holding it. Kalen found her at the Eastern Supply Post as the sun was beginning to drop toward late afternoon. He had the field dispatches in his hand, the confirmation of Morthian withdrawal from all 3 approach vectors, the preliminary report from Vane that the Citadel was secure, the notification that Duke Draven had attempted to leave the capital at the second bell and had been detained at the north gate by the residential guard. He handed her the dispatches without preamble. She read them. "Draven," she said. "In custody," he said. "Vane has the Morthian communication documents from his household. The cipher matches what you found in the dispatch tube." A pause. "It will be sufficient. Sufficient for treason." She did not say it aloud. They both knew what sufficient meant. "And Seraphine," she said. "No evidence of her direct involvement in the military coordination," Kalen said. "She knew the political strategy. There is not yet proof she knew about the Morthian operation specifically." He looked at the dispatch in her hands. "That may change as Vane works through the household records." She nodded. She handed the dispatches back. "The Emperor," she said. "Asking for you," he said. "By name. Formal summons. His seal." She looked at him. Something in the way he said it. Careful. Precise. The restraint of someone not saying the larger thing, the smaller thing is sitting inside. "When?" she said. "Now," he said. "If you're ready." She thought about ready. She thought about the word and what it had meant at various points in the past 2 days. Ready to walk through a king's door. Ready to stand in an assembly chamber. Ready to ride to a junction alone. She thought about the version of herself that had stood in the training yard before sunrise 2 mornings ago and hit a practice dummy until her knuckles split and believed, in the private interior she shared with no one, that this was the shape of her life. The early morning, the split hands, the careful self-sufficiency of someone who has learned not to expect the larger thing. "Yes," she said. The Emperor's private council chamber looked smaller at dusk than it had at dawn. The light through the high windows was the color of old iron, and it fell across the long table and the maps and the 2 men already in the room when she entered, Vane standing near the door, the Emperor in his chair at the head of the table, and Darius standing to the right of the door with the expression of someone who has spent the day at the end of a very long reckoning and is still in the middle of it. She did not look at Darius when she came in. She went to the table because that was where you went in this room. That was the architecture of it. Emperor Kalen looked at her for a long time. Not the assembly assessment, something slower and more private. The look of an old man who has watched many things from his chair and has learned to hold what he sees with the patience of someone who knows that the world reveals itself in its own time, regardless of how urgently you want to understand it. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He said, "I owe you an honest accounting." She had not expected that sentence from him. She held still. "I have known for 11 years that you were carrying something dormant," he said. "Not the specifics, the outline. There were records, incomplete, fragmentary, the kind of records that survive a purge rather than escape one, suggesting that the Vale line carried a trace of the old bloodline. I could not confirm it. I chose not to investigate further." But then he paused. "I chose specifically not to investigate further because the political complications of a confirmed shadow sovereign heir inside the Citadel were significant, and I made the calculation that an unconfirmed trace was a manageable ambiguity. The room was very quiet. "You left me in the margins," she said, "knowing there might be a reason not to." "I left you in the margins," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. She looked at the old man in the chair who had run an empire for 60 years and had made 10,000 decisions by the logic of what an empire requires. And she looked at him the way she had looked at Darius in the corridor outside the barracks. Not with anger, not with the heat of it, but with the precision of someone who is done making the thing smaller than it is. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. "Because what happened today changes the calculation," he said. "A confirmed manifestation of the Shadow Sovereign bloodline is not a manageable ambiguity. It is a fact. And I have spent 60 years running this empire on the understanding that facts must be addressed, or they address you." He looked at his hands. "I would rather address it honestly than wait for it to address me on its own terms." She thought about this. She thought about the specific quality of an apology from a man like this. Not the apology of guilt, which has an emotional quality to it, but the apology of a man who has done something he can justify and has decided, in the accounting, that justification and rightness are not the same thing. "I'm not going to tell you it's all right," she said. "It isn't. 11 years is a long time to be in the margins for a manageable ambiguity." "I know," he said. "But I'm not going to spend what comes next on what you didn't do," she said. "I have better things to do with it." He looked at her with something she did not have a name for that was close to respect and had a quality of something older in it. The recognition an old man has when he sees someone handling a heavy thing with more grace than he managed at their age. He turned to Kalen. "My son," he said, "made a decision 2 nights ago that cost the Empire a significant amount of political disruption." "Yes," Kalen said. "He also," the Emperor said, "made the correct decision." He looked at Lyanna. Under the Silver Compact, Chapter 14, the claim he made in the Hall of Moons was legally valid. The assembly vote that voided it was obtained through improperly influenced procedure. Draven's coordination and Darius's floor work in combination constitute actionable interference with an Imperial Compact proceeding. He paused. "I have consulted the Imperial Law Chancellor. The assembly vote is nullified on grounds of procedural corruption. The original claim stands." Lyanna sat very still. "The formal ratification," the Emperor said, "will be conducted before the full assembly within the week, with the interference on record and every house that voted against on notice that their reasoning will be examined." He looked at her. "That is not a guarantee of the outcome. There are houses that will vote against on genuine legal grounds, not corrupted ones, and their votes will stand. But the original interference is removed from the record." She looked at Kalen. He was watching her with the stillness she had learned to read as full presence. Not management, not strategy, just there, waiting for whatever she brought back from this. "This is not a thing being done to me," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever the assembly decides, it is not something happening to me. I am a participant in it." "Yes," the Emperor said. "I want a formal role in the Draven proceedings," she said. "Not as a witness, as an analyst. The intelligence picture on the Morthian operation is mine. I built it over 6 months and it saved this empire today, and I want that on the formal record in the treason proceedings." "Done," Kalen said. "And I want the Eastern Guard intelligence structure reviewed," she said. "There are flag protocols that need to change. There were 6 months of filed assessments on the Morthian repositioning that never reached upper command. That pathway failed. It needs to not fail again." The Emperor looked at her with the expression of a man who has just watched someone walk into his council chamber as one kind of person and reveal themselves to be another, larger kind, and is adjusting his understanding accordingly. Agreed, he said. She sat in the chair at the long table in the Emperor's council chamber, and she held, carefully, the strangeness of being agreed with by the most powerful man in the Empire on things she had been saying into empty rooms for 6 months. It did not feel like victory. It felt like the beginning of a different kind of work. The work that comes after you have survived the thing that was supposed to break you, and must now decide what to build in the space that survival opened up. That work would be harder than surviving. Surviving she knew how to do. Building was something she was going to have to learn. She thought she was ready to learn it. Darius found her on the eastern parapet as the last of the daylight went out. She had come there to stand in the dark for a few minutes without anyone needing anything from her, and she had heard his particular footstep in the corridor below before he came up, so she had time to prepare the quality of her stillness before he arrived. He stood beside her and looked out at the city. He was quiet for a while, and she let him be quiet, because they had both earned the right to stand in silence, and she was no longer performing patience she didn't feel. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I know. Not just for the vote," he said. "For all of it. 10 years of all of it." He paused. "I told myself that what I gave you was more than nothing, and that was true. But the truer thing is that I knew what you deserved, and I chose the smaller version of myself every time the cost of the larger one became visible." She looked at the city, the lights of the lower districts coming up in the dark, the river catching them and scattering them across the water. "I know," she said. "I've been trying to be angry at you, and I keep landing in something more tired than that. You are not a villain. You are a man who had every advantage and used it to be comfortable rather than good. And I stayed because I had decided that adjacent to love was close enough, and we were both wrong." She looked at him. "The thing I want from you now is not apology. It's the version of you that showed up at the barracks this morning with the information about Draven's meeting." "Possible." He looked at her. "That was the right thing done for possibly mixed reasons," she said. "That's fine. Most right things are. I want you to keep doing that. Not for me. Because you have enough intelligence and enough position to do a significant amount of good in this empire if you stop managing how you look long enough to act on what you actually know." He stood with it. She could see him holding it the way you hold a thing that is shaped differently from what you expected it to be. "I'll try," he said. "I know," she said. "That's enough for now." He left, and she watched him go, and she felt the specific sensation of a door closing. Not violently, not dramatically, but with the settled permanence of a thing that is finished because it has reached its actual end rather than being abandoned partway through. She did not feel free, exactly. She felt accurate. She felt the shape of the past 10 years as they actually were, rather than as she had been trying to make them be. And in that accuracy was something that would take a long time to fully process, but that had the quality of ground under it, solid, real, the kind of thing you can build on.
Wow.
Kaylin was in the antechamber when she came through the north corridor. Same room, same fire. The same cold cup on the side table that he had not been there to finish 2 nights ago had been replaced with a fresh one, and she noticed this and said nothing about it. He looked up when she entered. She closed the door. They stood on opposite sides of the room for a moment in the way of two people who have been through a large amount of territory together very quickly and are now standing in the quiet on the other side of it, taking inventory. "The assembly ratification," she said. "It will go the way it goes," he said. "Whatever the outcome." "Whatever the outcome, I am not going back to the gray uniform in the left wall," she said. "Not with heat, just accurately. That is done. The Emperor confirmed my intelligence work. The Draven proceedings will have my name on them. The Eastern Review is happening. I have a position in this empire that does not depend on any compact or claim or vote." She looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you that so you understand that what I am saying next is not contingent on it." He went very still in that processing way. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I want that to be on the record. I have spent 31 years building a very good interior life and a very defended perimeter, and I am not going to pretend that the past 2 days have resolved that, because they haven't." She paused. "But I am also not going to stand in a corridor at midnight and tell you that I walked through your door as a survival decision and then spend the rest of my life pretending that is all it was." He looked at her with the specific quality of a man who has been waiting for a thing he did not allow himself to be certain of. "I made a contingency," he said. "I know. 3 days before, I know, she said. I want to understand why. He crossed the room. Not to her. He stopped at the table, the same position he had occupied 2 nights ago. The maps between them, a different configuration now. The eastern border dispatches replaced with the preliminary treason documentation on Draven. Because I have spent 16 years making every decision by the logic of what an empire requires, he said. And I am very good at it, and it has cost me things I can feel the shape of even when I cannot name them. He looked at the map. And because watching you stand in this court and refuse to disappear made me understand that the thing I had been missing was not a strategic partner or a political asset or any of the categories I had been using for too long. He looked up. It was someone who was more interested in what was true than in what was safe. She looked at him. That's you, he said. It has been you for a long time. I just spent too long being careful about it. She crossed the room. She stopped at the table. They were on the same side of it, which was different from every conversation they had conducted across it in the past 2 days, and the geometry of that difference was not small. I need honesty, she said. Complete honesty. I have had 10 years of the other kind, and I know what it costs. You have it, he said. You already asked for it. I already agreed. I need to be a participant, she said. Not a decoration or a claim or an argument in a legal proceeding, a participant. You have been a participant since the moment you walked into this room 2 nights ago, he said. You were a participant before that. You were a participant when you were in a guard posting filing assessments that nobody read. You were a participant at the Grafen Junction before I got there. The participation is yours. It was always yours. A pause. I can't give you that. Nobody can give you that. What I can do is stop pretending it isn't there. She stood very close to him and looked at the face she had been reading for 2 days. The scar on the jaw, the specific tiredness behind the control, the quality of his eyes that she had first noticed across the Hall of Moons and had been cataloging ever since. She said, When I was 9 years old, I found a document that described me as survived by one minor daughter, and I spent 22 years after that trying to be more than a survival fact. You are more than a survival fact, he said. I know that now, she said. I knew it before, but knowing it in here, she put her hand against her sternum, the plain gesture of it, and knowing it in the way where someone else has also confirmed it, are different things, and I am not ashamed of needing both. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, flat and certain, the same way he made every decision. Not grasping, not claiming, just present, just there. She let him. There is something that the stories about power and survival rarely account for. What comes after? The stories end at the triumph, at the recognition, at the moment when the wrong is finally corrected and the right thing is finally said out loud. They end there because that is the shape of a satisfying story. But life is not shaped like a satisfying story. Life continues past the recognition into the harder and quieter work of actually becoming the thing you have just been told you are. Lyanna Vale would spend the months that followed doing exactly that work. She would sit in the Draven treason proceedings and deliver 6 months of intelligence analysis into the formal record and watch the Empire slowly understand what it had dismissed. She would work through the Eastern Intelligence Review and change the flag protocols and make the pathway function in ways it hadn't before. She would stand in the revised assembly vote and hold still while 300 houses made their calculation and arrive, this time, at a different answer. Not a landslide, not unanimous, a genuine contested vote from which she emerged with a majority that was real because it had not been bought. She would wake up some morning still expecting the margins. She would reach for the careful self-sufficiency of someone alone and find, in its place, the different and harder practice of someone who has a person to be honest with and has to be honest even when honesty is expensive. She would not always manage it perfectly. Neither would he. They would have the arguments that two people have when both of them are accustomed to operating alone and must learn, across time and friction and occasional genuine failure, how to be something that neither of them had been before. She would also, in the small hours of certain mornings when the Citadel was at its quietest, sit with the eastern border maps she had moved to the king's antechamber and feel the light in her hands that was becoming something she could hold deliberately rather than something that arrived on its own terms. and she would understand incrementally the full weight of what she was carrying, not the burden of it, though that was real, but the responsibility of it. The Shadow Sovereign bloodline was not a gift in the way of comfortable things. It was the specific kind of gift that requires the carrier to be equal to it, and being equal to it would require everything she had. She found when she sat with that she was not afraid. She had never been afraid of hard work. Hard work was what she knew. Duke Draven was tried and convicted of high treason in the 53rd year of Emperor Kaelin's reign. The sentence was exile rather than execution. The Emperor's final calculation. The mercy of a man who had watched too many cycles of violence conclude that the end of a man is less valuable than the dismantling of the system that made him. House Draven was dissolved. Its estates were absorbed into the Imperial Reserve. Lady Seraphine, for whom no direct evidence of military coordination was found, was given conditional freedom and the very clear understanding that her father's ambition had consumed the future she had been building, and that she would need to build a different one. Lyanna watched Seraphine leave the Citadel on the morning after the sentencing. The woman carried herself well. The specific discipline of someone who has lost a large and important thing and has decided somewhere in the overnight not to be seen collapsing under it. Lyanna recognized that discipline intimately. She did not hate Seraphine. She found she did not have the energy for it, and more than that, she had no use for it. Hatred requires you to keep looking at the thing that caused the injury, and Lyanna was done looking backward at anything that did not serve the direction she was moving. She was moving forward. The highest balcony of the Imperial Citadel faced east, which meant it faced the border, which meant it faced the pass and the ridge and the Grafin Junction and everything that had happened on the morning when the Empire finally ran out of time to ignore what had been standing in its margins. Lyanna stood on it on a morning 6 months after the events that the Imperial record would eventually call the Night of the Silver Moon, a name chosen by the court's historians for its poetic quality, which she found slightly annoying in its imprecision, but accepted because precision was her priority and naming was other people's. The city below was doing its ordinary work. The lower districts were active, the markets, the river traffic, the particular noise of 100,000 lives running parallel to the large official events of the Empire, and mostly unconcerned with them. She looked at it and thought about what it meant to be responsible for something this large. Not the weight of it. She had been thinking about the weight for months and had arrived at a functional relationship with it, but the specific quality of the responsibility. It was not about control. It was not about dominance or the traditional imperial vocabulary of power. It was about attention. It was about looking at the city and the border and the intelligence reports and the people who filed assessments that needed to reach upper command and making sure the attention was honest and consistent and present. She was good at attention. She had been practicing it for 31 years. Kaelin came through the balcony door and stood beside her. He looked at the city. He looked at her. "The morning report," he said. "Vane briefed me already," she said. "The northern passes are clear. The Morthian delegation is 3 days out." The formal diplomatic proceedings, the consequence of a failed military operation, and the Empire's insistence on a proper accounting, were a different kind of work than the treason trial, slower and more technical, and in some ways more important. She had been in the preparatory meetings for 2 weeks. "You should lead the opening session," he said. "I intended to," she said. Something moved in his face that was the closest he came to the expression she thought of, privately, as his pleased expression, the one he almost never deployed in public because he had spent too long being careful and was still learning that careful was not always the right tool. She had spent 6 months cataloging the expressions he almost never deployed. She had a working taxonomy. "The Assembly confirmed the Eastern Intelligence Review proposals," he said. "Full implementation begins at the 1st of next month." She nodded. She had known it was coming. She had written most of the proposals. "It will make a difference," she said. "Not immediately. The structures take time to change, but the pathway works correctly now. Something flagged in the Eastern posting will reach upper command." She paused. "That's worth more than the specific intelligence. It's worth the principle of the thing." He looked at her the way he looked at her when she said something he had been thinking and had not yet said, the specific quality of recognition between two people who have been talking long enough to recognize each other's thinking before it is fully articulated. "Yes," he said. She looked at the city. She thought about the girl who had read a document at 9 years old that described her as an afterthought in her own parents' story. She thought about the training yard before sunrise, and the split knuckles, and the decade of being told she was a category error. She thought about standing in the left wall of the Hall of Moons, in a gray guard uniform with no house crest, and hearing a man's voice cut through the ceremony and speak her name as though it mattered. She thought about what it had cost her to get here, and she decided, not for the first time and not for the last, that the accounting was not the point. The accounting was the past. What was present was the city below and the border to the east, and the work that needed doing, and the person standing beside her who had decided 3 days before any of this began that she was worth a contingency. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. He had a habit of that which she had stopped pretending she didn't appreciate. "Tell me something true," she said. It was a habit they had developed, something that had started in the antechamber in the first days and had become the specific ritual of two people who had both lived too long in strategic disclosure and were practicing the alternative. He thought about it the way he always did, genuinely, not reaching for the available answer, but the honest one. "I was afraid at the junction," he said, "not of the soldiers, of the 2 minutes before the secondary post arrived, when I didn't know if the order I'd sent had reached them." "I know," she said. "I was afraid of the same thing. You didn't show it. Neither did you." "That's what we do," he said. "Yes," she said. "But we don't have to do it with each other." He looked at her with the full quality of it, not the king's assessment, not the field commander's calculation, just the man in the space between the performed versions of himself, the specific person she had been learning to know across 6 months of hard circumstances and quieter ones. "No," he said. "We don't." The empire spread below them, and the sun came up over the eastern ridge, and the day began its ordinary work. And two people who had spent their lives in the particular loneliness of being good at things that nobody had thought to value stood in the morning light and held what they had built and understood, each in their own way, that this was the thing that outlasts everything. Not the crown, not the bloodline, not the legal compact or the assembly vote or the treason proceedings or any of the official record that the historians would argue about for generations. This, two people who had found in each other the specific thing that power cannot manufacture and circumstance cannot guarantee, the willingness to be seen completely and the courage to keep looking. She had spent 31 years being told she was worth nothing. She had spent the last 6 months learning what it cost to believe otherwise. The crown of the empire was not the weight she was carrying. The weight she was carrying was older and more personal, and more worth the effort than any crown she could have been given. She was carrying the weight of herself, finally and completely and without apology. She had arrived.